Chapter 908. Qin Feiyang and the other two passed through the golden light curtain and appeared in a dim corridor. The corridor stretched to the end of the other side. On both sides, there was a stone door every 10 meters. Every stone door was tightly shut, and there was a number on each door. Boom! Just as Qin Feiyang was sizing up these stone doors, the pagoda doors behind him suddenly closed. Phew! That scared me to death. My heart almost jumped out of my chest when the patriarch asked for your name. The commander of the Kirin army patted his chest and turned to look at Qin Feiyang. His face was full of fear. Indeed, his question was too unexpected. Yigleo nodded. One of you is a combat emperor and the other is a fake god. How can you be scared by this? You're too useless. Qin Feiyang looked at the two of them with disdain. We're useless. The two of them looked at each other with anger in their eyes. Since you're so powerful, why do you look so scared? The commander of the Kirin army said. Can't you tell? I'm just faking it. Qin Feiyang sneered. The commander of the Kirin army was stunned. If I appear too calm, then it will really be suspicious. Qin Feiyang glanced at him indifferently and then glanced at the stone doors on both sides of the corridor. Heard about it. The commander of the Kirin army and Yigleo looked at each other with a hint of fear in their eyes. That person just now was a genuine 9-star combat emperor. If it were other young people, they would definitely be scared out of their wits. But this person was so calm. This kind of calm temperament really made people feel scared. Suddenly, the two of them felt a cold current appear again. The temperature here dropped sharply as if it was winter. The two of them looked at Qin Feiyang again. They found that Qin Feiyang's eyes had changed. There was a hint of killing intent in the coldness, like a pair of sharp eagle eyes. The cold current that appeared came from Qin Feiyang's body. Which cell is my mother locked in? Qin Feiyang asked in a bone-chilling voice. The last cell, the commander of the Kirin army said. He led Qin Feiyang to the end of the corridor and stopped in front of the stone door on the left. Open it, Qin Feiyang said hurriedly as he stared at the stone door. You have to be mentally prepared. The commander of the Kirin army hesitated. Qin Feiyang nodded. The commander of the Qilin army held the golden token in his hand and faced the stone door of the prison cell. Whoosh! A beam of golden divine light shot out and entered the stone door. Boom! Boom! The stone door slowly. A terrifying wave of destructive energy surged out from the crack in the door. Crack! At the same time, deafening claps of thunder could be heard from behind the stone door. Through the crack, Qin Feiyang could clearly see that there was a sea of purple lightning inside. Without waiting for the stone door to open, Qin Feiyang impatiently rushed in. The scene of the entire cell entered his field of vision. The cell was about 100 zhang wide. There was nothing in it except for the purple lightning tribulation. The bolts of lightning filled every corner of the cell, emitting an apocalyptic aura. These lightning tribulations can even kill a 1-star combat emperor. You just ran in here like that. Are you tired of living? At the same time, seeing Qin Feiyang barge into the cell, Yigleo's expression changed drastically. He quickly ran in and shouted angrily. As he spoke, he waved his hand and a divine power barrier was formed, protecting Qin Feiyang. Rumble! Crack! The bolts of lightning struck the barrier ferociously, producing deafening booms. However, Qin Feiyang acted as if he didn't hear Yigleo's scolding. His gaze was fixed on the center of the cell. There a white-clothed woman was sitting cross-legged. Looking at the white-clothed woman, Qin Feiyang's eyes became misty, blurring his vision. Wasn't that his mother? He remembered clearly. The last time he saw his mother, although she had already taken off her phoenix coronet and phoenix robe, losing her usual elegance, she was still in good spirits. But now, the very old white dress she was wearing had become extremely tattered. Her long black hair was now like straw, yellow and disheveled. Wrinkles began to appear on her youthful face. She looked old and her eyes were dim. She looked worse than a woman in her 40s or 50s. Qin Feiyang felt as if his heart was being cut by a knife. Only a few years had passed and his mother had become like this? He could imagine how much pain his mother had gone through in the years he had left the imperial capital. However, the white-clothed woman didn't seem to notice Qin Feiyang's arrival. She didn't open her eyes. The bolts of tribulation lightning continued to strike her, ravaging her body and tormenting her mind. Alas! The commander of the Kirin army also entered the cell. Standing in the divine power barrier, he looked at the white-clothed woman and finally sighed deeply. He bowed and said, "Greetings, Your Majesty." However, the white-clothed woman still didn't open her eyes, as if she didn't hear him. Her expression didn't change either. "Mother, it's me." Qin Feiyang walked forward step by step and said softly, "Tian." The white-clothed woman's body trembled, and she finally opened her eyes. However, Qin Feiyang had changed his appearance. Looking at this unfamiliar face, the white-clothed woman quickly calmed down, and her eyes revealed a trace of indifference. "Mother, it's really me." Qin Feiyang quickly took out a face-restoring pill and stuffed it into his mouth. In the blink of an eye, his appearance was restored. "Tian." The indifference in the white-clothed woman's eyes instantly melted. 2 drops of clear tears flowed from the corners of her eyes. Looking at the tears in the corners of his mother's eyes, Qin Feiyang's heart collapsed. He quickly ran over and knelt in front of his mother. He raised his hand and slapped his own face. He blamed himself and said, "Mother, I'm useless. I let you suffer here." The white-clothed woman quickly grabbed Qin Feiyang's wrist and shook her head. "Tian, don't blame yourself. It's not your fault. It's my fault. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't be trapped here and suffer the pain of the lightning tribulations." Qin Feiyang was so guilty that he wanted to kill himself in front of his mother to atone for his sins. "Silly child, as long as you can live well, it will be the greatest comfort for your mother." The white-clothed woman reached out and touched Qin Feiyang's face. Her eyes were full of love. Her slightly aged face seemed to have regained its youthfulness, becoming bright and beautiful. Her dim eyes were finally filled with color. "Mother!" Qin Feiyang looked at the white-clothed woman. His heart was bleeding. Suddenly, he turned to look at the commander of the Kirin army and shouted, "What are you waiting for? Remove the lightning tribulations for me." The white-clothed woman was stunned. She raised her head and looked at the commander of the Kirin army. There was a trace of suspicion in her eyes. Qin Feiyang saw his mother's suspicion and said with a smile, "Mother, he is now under my control." "Under your control." The white-clothed woman was surprised. "In the Forgotten Continent, I have mastered a secret technique that can enslave others. Now I can erase his soul with just a thought. Mother, you don't have to worry." Qin Feiyang said, "There's such a secret technique?" The white-clothed woman was shocked. "I will explain the details to you slowly after we leave the penitentiary," Qin Feiyang said with a smile. He turned to look at the commander of the Kirin army again and said angrily, "Didn't you hear what I said?" "It's not that I didn't hear it. It's that I can't do it. These lightning tribulations can only be removed by the 2 ancestors outside." The commander of the Kirin army was in a difficult position. Yiglao looked at the commander of the Kirin army and waved his hand. The divine power barrier suddenly expanded and covered the white-clothed woman. The white-clothed woman looked at Yiglao in surprise. "Thank you." Qin Feiyang looked at Yiglao and thanked him. Then he looked at the commander of the Kirin army and said coldly, "Then you go and bring Lu Xingchen and the others to me, as well as the old man and Zhu Yu." "Okay." The commander of the Kirin army nodded and walked out of the divine power barrier. Although the lightning tribulations here were terrifying, the commander of the Kirin army could withstand them for a while. The white-clothed woman looked at Yigleo and asked, "Tian, who is this?" Qin Feiyong smiled and said, "He's from the Forgotten Continent. This time I was able to come back and sneak into the god's prison, thanks to his help." The white-clothed woman nodded and stood up with the help of Qin Feiyong. She bowed to Yigleo and said, "Thank you, Senior, for taking care of Tian." Although Yigleo controlled his cultivation to be at the level of a 1-star battle saint, the divine power barrier exposed his true cultivation. "Thank him?" A trace of displeasure crawled up Qin Feiyong's face as he said, "Mother, he and I only have a relationship of mutual benefit. There's no need to thank him." "Tian, you can't be so rude. Even if you're using each other, he's helping you now. You should thank him." The white-clothed woman said with a straight face. Qin Feiyong felt wronged. All these years, the Mu family had harmed him a lot, especially the Mu family's great ancestor and second ancestor. They had tried to kill him many times. Who would have thought that his mother would scold him now? Of course, he knew that his mother didn't know about these things, but he still felt uncomfortable. Yigleo glanced at Qin Feiyong and couldn't help but laugh. He then looked at the white-clothed woman and cupped his hands and said, "Madam, you're too polite." As little brother Qin Feiyong said, "We're indeed using each other. But if he could see the big picture like you, then there wouldn't be so many conflicts between us. You're taking advantage of me?" Qin Feiyong raised his eyebrows and glared at Yigleo. Yigleo chuckled and fell silent again. Qin Feiyong glared at him and turned to look at his mother. He frowned and said, "All these years, father, didn't he come to see you?" "No." The white-clothed woman shook her head and looked a little disappointed. "That heartless bastard. I'll make him pay the price sooner or later." Qin Feiyong was burning with anger. No matter what happened, they were still husband and wife. So what if he came to see her? "You can't say that. After all, he's your father." The white-clothed woman sighed. "He's so heartless, and you're still speaking for him? He's not worthy to be my father. I don't want to be associated with him now." Chapter 909. Looking at Qin Feiyong's eyes and attitude, the white-clothed woman's expression was extremely complicated. She didn't know how to persuade him, because she knew that what the emperor had done these years had cast a great shadow in Qin Feiyong's heart. This shadow could not be erased for a lifetime. "Feiyong!" Suddenly, a heavenly voice sounded behind Qin Feiyong. "Sister!" Qin Feiyong's body trembled, and he hurriedly turned around to see a beautiful figure standing at the door. After not seeing each other for many years, Ren Wuxuang was still so beautiful and moving. Even though at the moment her clothes were ragged and her hair was messy, it still could not hide her charm from head to toe. Yigleo once again activated his divine power, allowing the divine power barrier to envelop the entire cell. "Did you miss me?" With a cynical smile, Qin Feiyong walked towards Ren Wuxuang. Then, Ren Wuxuang flew over and smashed into Qin Feiyong's arms. Ren Wuxuang's sudden behavior made Qin Feiyong somewhat at a loss, because after being together for so long, it was the first time he had such intimate contact with Ren Wuxuang. With this beauty in his arms, the delicate fragrance assailed his nostrils, making him unable to help but feel restless. "Who has time to miss you? Less narcissism," Ren Wuxuang scolded. But her heart was unprecedentedly at ease, and her beautiful eyes were filled with a mist. Although she herself was in prison, she was most worried about Qin Feiyong, because the imperial preceptor had told her that Qin Feiyong did not have a good life in the Forgotten Continent and was hunted down all day. So, at this moment, when she saw Qin Feiyong in person, her inner emotions could not be controlled. Qin Feiyong was stunned, and then his heart relaxed a lot. Although Ren Wuxuang was very charming, he had always treated Ren Wuxuang as his older sister. And Ren Wuxuang, like him, must have simply regarded him as a younger brother. Between siblings, there was nothing wrong with having intimate contact once in a while. He raised his head and gently patted Ren Wuxuang's shoulder. "Sis, I'm sorry for making you worry. If you know that I'm worried, why didn't you come back earlier?" Ren Wuxuang scolded. Qin Feiyang sighed deeply and said, "I also wanted to come back earlier, but all right. Don't say any more. I know you're in trouble. As long as you're safe, it's fine." Ren Wuxuang smiled and stood up from Qin Feiyang's arms. Looking at Qin Feiyang's face, her expression was full of concern. Qin Feiyang's heart warmed. He hurriedly turned around and pulled Ren Wuxuang to his mother. "Mother, let me introduce you. Her name is Ren Wuxuang. She's my sister in the spirit state." Wuxuang greets Auntie. Ren Wuxuang also hurriedly bowed, appearing gentle and polite, decent and generous. "Thank you for taking care of Tian, in the spirit state." The woman in white grabbed Ren Wuxuang's hand and said with a smile in her eyes, "Auntie is too polite. Actually, Feiyang took care of me a little more." Ren Wuxuang scratched her head awkwardly. Qin Feiyang looked at Ren Wuxuang strangely and chuckled. "Sis, you weren't so honest before. What did you say?" Ren Wuxuang glared at him with her almond-shaped eyes. It was her first time meeting the legendary Empress Dowager. Of course, she had to perform well and leave a good impression. But she didn't expect this guy to be so tactless and expose her in public. He didn't give her any face at all. Qin Feiyang chuckled and decisively took a few steps back. He was quite clear about the character of this tigress. She would flip out whenever she wanted, regardless of whether there was anyone around. "Feiyang, you're back." At this moment, another old voice could be heard from behind. "Old master." Qin Feiyang's spirit was lifted, and he hurriedly turned to look at the door. The old man was standing outside the door. His clothes were tattered. He looked extremely haggard. However, at this moment, his aged face was glowing and full of smiles. "Old master, I'm sorry. It's all my fault." Qin Feiyang strode to the front of the old man and lowered his head with an apologetic expression. "Silly boy, what's there to be sorry about? When I learned of your true identity, I guessed that this day would come sooner or later." The old man smiled, his face full of affection. Qin Feiyang asked cautiously, "Then you don't blame me for lying to you?" He remembered that when he and Mu Qing entered the Forgotten Continent, he didn't reveal his true identity to the old man. "Of course I do. But now that things have come to this, what else can I say?" The old man shook his head and sighed. Then he looked at the woman in white and bowed. "Greetings, Empress." "Elder Rin, you're welcome." The woman in white smiled. It could be seen that the old man took care of Qin Feiyang a lot in the spiritual state. As for the people that had taken care of Qin Feiyang, she was very grateful. "You're really lucky. I thought you would die in the Forgotten Continent." At this moment, another familiar voice sounded. Qin Feiyang frowned and turned to look at the door. He saw a young man in white slowly walking into the cell. It was Lu Xingchen. "You're not dead yet. How can I bear to die?" Qin Feiyang smiled faintly. As he spoke, he glanced at Yiglao. However, he found that Yiglao's eyes didn't change much when he saw Lu Xingchen. At the same time, Lu Xingchen also glanced at Yiglao, but his expression didn't change much. Then he looked at Qin Feiyang and smiled. "My life is tough. I'm afraid no one can take it away." "That's not necessarily true." Qin Feiyang shook his head and smiled, but he was extremely confused. Yiglao did everything he could to save Lu Xingchen, but now that he saw Lu Xingchen in person, why didn't he do anything? What were these people trying to hide? "Brother Qin, long time no see. How have you been?" Suddenly, accompanied by a vigorous voice, Dong Xingyang also walked into the cell. Behind Dong Xingyang, there was Shen Mei and the ugly old woman Juyu. Now, all the servants were present. Yes, time passes so fast. Several years have passed in the blink of an eye. Qin Feiyang sighed and then nodded to Shenmei with a smile. After a few years, this woman had become more mature and feminine. Welcome back. Shenmei also smiled. Thank you, Qin Feiyang said. Shenmei smiled, looked at the woman in white, and asked, She's your mother, right? Qin Feiyang nodded. Greetings, Auntie. Shenmei and Dong Zhenyang immediately walked over and bowed. Zhu Yu glanced at Qin Feiyang and was about to bow to the woman in white. But Qin Feiyang blocked in front of her. What's wrong? Zhu Yu looked at him suspiciously. Qin Feiyang bowed deeply and said, First of all, I want to apologize to you. If it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have been locked up here. It's fine. Zhu Yu waved her hand and waited for him to continue. Qin Feiyang pondered for a moment, then sent a sound transmission. The Forgotten Continent is forbidden to enter. But why did you let me in? At first, he didn't know that the Emperor had ordered that no one was allowed to enter the Forgotten Continent. So, when Zhu Yu asked him to go to the Forgotten Continent to snatch the heavenly thunder flames, he didn't suspect anything. But later on, when he found out about these things, he felt that Zhu Yu's purpose was not simple. Later on, when he found out about the secret hidden in the heavenly thunder flames, he was even more convinced that Zhu Yu had other motives. He even suspected that Zhu Yu might also know the secret hidden in the heavenly thunder flames. If that was the case, then Zhu Yu's identity was definitely not as simple as it seemed on the surface. And hearing Qin Feiyang's question, Zhu Yu also replied without hesitation, I just want you to go and gain experience. Gain experience? Qin Feiyang frowned. Gain experience was equivalent to nurturing. In other words, Zhu Yu's words meant that she was nurturing him. However, Zhu Yu privately asked him to go to the Forgotten Continent, which was disobeying the Emperor's orders. This was a capital offense, risking her head to let him go to the Forgotten Continent to gain experience. How could this be justified? It was reasonable to say that their relationship was especially good. For example, he was some kind of relative of Zhu Yu. But back then, he and Zhu Yu didn't know each other at all. So in Qin Feiyang's view, Zhu Yu's reason was too far-fetched and not convincing at all. Qin Feiyang sighed. Senior, I can basically conclude that you have no ill intentions towards me and are really doing it for my own good. But it is precisely because of this that you should tell me everything. Zhu Yu was silent. Senior, to tell you the truth, I already know the hidden secret of the heavenly thunder flame. I was also thinking, do you also know? Qin Feiyang said again. Already know? Zhu Yu looked at him in surprise. Yes. Moreover, not only the heavenly thunder flame, the mysterious sky flame, and the ice flame are also in my hands now. Qin Feiyang said. This, Zhu Yu was extremely shocked. After a moment, she smiled bitterly and said to herself, I didn't expect you to see through it so quickly. You are indeed extremely smart. But I'm sorry, I really can't say it now, because I don't want to affect you. But there is one thing I can tell you. I do know the hidden secret of the heavenly thunder flame. The reason why I asked you to snatch the heavenly thunder flame is precisely to let you enter that miracle. Zhu Yu said. Hearing these words, Qin Feiyang's heart trembled. Zhu Yu was indeed nurturing him. But why was this? They had no relatives or friends. They were complete strangers. What benefits did this have for her? However, Zhu Yu ignored him and walked towards the woman in white without looking back. Lu Xingqian looked at Zhu Yu, then looked at Qin Feiyang, and asked secretly, What did you and her say in secret? It has something to do with you? Qin Feiyang raised his head and looked at him from the corner of his eyes. All right, pretend I didn't ask. Lu Xingqian shrugged his shoulders with an innocent look on his face. Qin Feiyang looked at Lu Xingqian. His heart suddenly moved and sent a sound transmission. Were you the one who went to the treasure pavilion to purchase medicinal herbs in the past few years? Lu Xingqian was startled and asked in confusion. In the past few years, I have indeed gone to the treasure pavilion to purchase a lot of medicinal herbs. But why do I not understand what you mean? Qin Feiyang said, the medicinal herbs I am talking about are the potential pill. This. Chapter 910. Qin Feiyang sized up Lu Xingqian. Lu Xingqian's emotions were very sincere, and there was no trace of falsehood in them. But he didn't dare to believe Lu Xingqian, because Lu Xingqian was a person who was better at disguising than him. So he couldn't judge whether Lu Xingqian was telling the truth or not. Cough, cough. Suddenly, Yiglao, who had been silent the whole time, put his fist to his mouth and coughed. Everyone was slightly stunned and looked at him, and Dong Xingyang and the others only noticed this old man now. It was also only now that they realized that the lightning tribulation here was blocked by a barrier, and the owner of the barrier was this old man. Their hearts were suddenly set off by stormy waves. To be able to easily block these lightning tribulations, how strong was this old man's cultivation? At the same time, Yiglao glanced at everyone and said, although this old man doesn't want to ruin the atmosphere of your reunion after a long separation, this old man has to say something. It's not good to stay here for long. It's best to leave immediately. Hearing this, Qin Feiyang suddenly quivered and wanted to slap himself a few times. Where was this? This was the god's prison. He actually had the mood to chat here, wasn't he courting death? If the Imperial Preceptor suddenly barged in, wouldn't they all be wiped out? Qin Feiyang looked at Yiglao and said, quickly open the space-time gate and return to the forgotten continent. Yiglao nodded, and the space-time gate immediately rushed out of his body. Tiana, I can't leave. But at this moment, the woman in white said, what? Qin Feiyang was stunned. Feiyang, I can't leave either. The old man followed. This, Qin Feiyang looked at the two of them, not knowing what to do for a moment. You know this old man's character. As the former lord of the spiritual state, this old man will never betray the great Qin Empire. The old man said. Qin Feiyang said angrily, it was the emperor who was heartless first. How can this be called betrayal? No matter what, we are all subjects. If you want me to die, I have no choice but to die. What's more, His Majesty only imprisoned us. He didn't say he would kill us. Feiyang, we won't ask what you do. Even if one day you and His Majesty become enemies, we won't persuade you. But we also hope that you can respect our choice. Old Master said. Qin Feiyang was furious to the extreme. He roared, do you know that this is blind loyalty? The old man smiled and said, even if it's blind loyalty, this old man will not regret it. Qin Feiyang looked at his mother and asked, Mother, what's your reason? If I could leave, I would have left with you last time. The white-clothed woman sighed. Why? Can you tell me? Don't say things like you're still young, and I don't want you to worry. I don't want you to bear too heavy a burden. Now that I've grown up, I can bear it with you. Qin Feiyang roared. Why did he come back this time? Wasn't it to take everyone out of the great Qin Empire? But the two most important people in his life had chosen to stay in the divine penitentiary. How could he not be anxious? Seeing Qin Feiyang's anxious look, the white-clothed woman couldn't help but feel distressed. But sometimes you can't do whatever you want. Tell me. Otherwise, I'll go find him now. At worst, I'll die. Qin Feiyang said in a deep voice. He was about to lose his mind. This he naturally referred to the emperor. When the white-clothed woman heard Qin Feiyang's angry words, she was a little angry. She said, Then tell me, can you defeat the state preceptor and your father? Qin Feiyang fell silent. The white-clothed woman sighed and said, When you have the strength to defeat them, I will tell you why you can't leave. Lu Xingqian's eyes flashed. He cupped his hands and said, Your Majesty, I have a question that has been puzzling me. I hope you can answer it for me. Go ahead. The white-clothed woman looked at Lu Xingqian. Qin Feiyang's grandfather is your father. Even the emperor is afraid of his strength. Why don't you ask him for help? Lu Xingqian asked. Yes, we can go to Grandpa. Mother, give me the coordinates of Grandpa's house. I'll go find him right away. Qin Feiyang quivered and said hurriedly. However, hearing this, the white-clothed woman's face turned cold. She said angrily, Tian, you're really disappointing me. Disappointed? Qin Feiyang looked at his mother suspiciously. What did he do to disappoint his mother? The white-clothed woman said, Remember, don't always think of asking others for help. You have to rely on yourself. Does Grandpa count as someone else? Qin Feiyang asked. He really couldn't figure out why his mother was hesitating. Your grandfather is old. We can't let him worry about us anymore, so I won't let you go to him. The white-clothed woman said in a tone that brooked no disobedience. It's so strange, Lu Xingqian muttered. Logically speaking, with such a big thing happening, even if the white-clothed woman didn't ask for help, Qin Feiyang's grandfather should have received the news. But why didn't he show up? Could it be, suddenly, Lu Xingqian seemed to think of something. His eyes trembled slightly. He looked at Qin Feiyang and said, I can't leave with you either. I don't plan to take you away. You can do whatever you want. Qin Feiyang said impatiently. You? Lu Xingqian immediately glared at him and said, We used to fight side by side. Aren't you afraid of making me sad by saying this? Qin Feiyang ignored him. Lu Xingqian was very embarrassed. He thought that Qin Feiyang would more or less ask why he didn't leave, but he didn't expect that he didn't ask anything. To be exact, he didn't exist at all. Why do I have to do this? He sighed secretly, but Qin Feiyang didn't care about Lu Xingqian, but it didn't mean that others didn't care. For example, Mu Qing at this moment in the castle was already anxious to jump over the wall. At the same time, Yiglao also looked at Lu Xingqian. Although he didn't say anything, his confused eyes proved everything. Lu Xingqian certainly noticed Yiglao's eyes, but he just smiled faintly. However, it was unknown whether the two of them were communicating in secret. Alas! Looking at the silent Qin Feiyang, the white-clothed woman sighed softly and said with a smile, Her mother is already very satisfied that you can come back to see Mother. Don't delay any longer. Go quickly. Qin Feiyang closed his eyes in pain. Where's the commander of the Kirin army? Suddenly, Dong Jingyang's surprised voice sounded. As soon as he said this, everyone scanned the prison cell, but they couldn't find the commander of the Kirin army. Yiglao's expression changed, and he hurriedly said, Go outside and take a look. Lu Xingqian turned around and took a step out, landing in the corridor outside, and said in a deep voice, He's gone. Damn it. Yiglao's eyes darkened, and he hurriedly looked at Qin Feiyang and shouted, He must have slipped away when we weren't paying attention. Quickly erase his soul. He should have already informed the emperor and the state preceptor. You must leave quickly, or it will be too late. Lu Xingqian returned to the prison cell and urged. Yiglao waved his arm, and a palm-sized space-time gate floated in the air. Following closely, his index finger pointed in the air, and streams of divine power rushed out crazily. The space-time gate also suddenly bloomed with dazzling brilliance. Whoosh! It was also at this moment. Qin Feiyang finally opened his eyes, and two shocking murderous intents burst out. Ever since he took control of the commander of the Kirin army, it was only at that time that he peeked into the inner thoughts of the commander of the Kirin army. After that, he didn't peek, because, in his opinion, the commander of the Kirin army knew the horror of the slave seal and shouldn't be rash. But he didn't expect that he would betray him at this time. However, just as he was about to erase the soul of the commander of the Kirin army, a series of steady footsteps suddenly sounded in the corridor outside. Could it be that he's here? Everyone turned pale with fright. What will come will eventually come. Qin Feiyang took a deep breath and looked up at the door. Everyone also gathered together and stared at the door. The footsteps were getting closer and closer, but they couldn't sense any aura, as if a ghost was walking in the corridor. After a few breaths, finally, an old man in white who seemed to have an immortal aura appeared outside the door. State Preceptor. Immediately, everyone's pupils contracted. At the same time, State Preceptor stopped and stood outside the door. He glanced at Qin Feiyang and the others, and a bright smile appeared on his old face. You finally came back. Finally. His eyes fell on Qin Feiyang and he laughed. Isn't this just as you wish? Qin Feiyang said. Seeing State Preceptor in person, the tension in his heart disappeared. So, are you going to take the initiative to hand over Chang Shui and the castle, or do you want me to do it myself? State Preceptor looked at him with a smile. I want to ask, do you want Chang Shui and the castle, or do you want His Majesty? The woman in white walked out and stood beside Qin Feiyang, looking at State Preceptor, and asked, Greetings, Your Majesty. State Preceptor bowed symbolically and said with a smile, It's me and His Majesty. The woman in white raised her eyebrows and said, I'm afraid it's you. I want to see His Majesty. State Preceptor shook his head and said, His Majesty is accompanying the little prince, and probably has no time to see you. The little prince, the woman in white frowned. Mother, don't you know? He and that woman gave birth to another Ryuko, and they named him Qin Haotian. They even built a Haotian palace for this Ryuko. Qin Feiyang said word by word. His eyes were filled with anger that couldn't be dispersed. What? The woman in white trembled, and her slightly aged cheeks turned pale in an instant. I told everyone to hide this from you, Your Majesty. I was afraid that you would be angry after hearing it. Please forgive me, Your Majesty. State Preceptor bowed and said with a smile. Qin Feiyang looked at his mother worriedly, then looked at State Preceptor and shouted, Put away your hypocritical face! It seems that you have a big prejudice against me. Actually, there's really no need to do this. As long as you hand over Chang Shui and the castle, I'll immediately go to His Majesty and plead for you. At that time, not only will your mother be free, but your friends will also not have to suffer in the divine penitentiary. State Preceptor said with a smile, Plead for me? Lord State Preceptor, isn't that a little funny? I heard that His Majesty didn't intend to imprison you in the divine penitentiary. It was you who begged His Majesty repeatedly, and he finally did so. Moreover, it was your idea to imprison us in the divine penitentiary. Now, you're using this matter to play the good guy. Isn't that too unethical? As a person, especially when you're the State Preceptor of the great Qin Empire, you're above everyone else. It's best to have some face. Chapter 911. The Imperial Preceptor narrowed his eyes and looked at Lu Xingchen. You are very bold. I was just speaking the truth. If I have offended the Imperial Preceptor, I hope you can forgive me. Lu Xingchen bowed and said. His attitude was neither servile nor overbearing, and there was no fear at all. The Imperial Preceptor looked at him coldly, then looked at Qin Feiyang and said with a smile, Your Highness, please make a decision quickly. Impossible. Qin Feiyang shook his head. Clang. Rumble. The space-time gate continued to expand, and the aura it emitted became stronger and stronger. The Imperial Preceptor was not surprised when he heard Qin Feiyang's reply. He raised his head and looked at the space-time gate and Yigleo. His old eyes flashed, and he said with a smile, Not bad, you actually invited a false god to help, but at this point, the Imperial Preceptor's eyes turned cold, and he said, Even if a false god helps you, don't think about escaping again without my permission. Boom! As soon as he finished speaking, he raised his hand and waved it. A terrifying divine power surged out and pounced towards Qin Feiyang and the others in the cell. Qin Feiyang and the others did not hide and hurriedly hid behind Yigleo. "Aren't you looking down on this old man too much?" Yigleo snorted from his nose, and a majestic divine power emerged from his body and fiercely rushed out. Boom! The two divine powers collided, and a destructive aura suddenly shrouded the entire cell. The entire divine prison trembled violently at this moment. Qin Feiyang and the others hiding behind Yigleo, although they were protected by Yigleo, were still seriously injured. They spat out blood, and their faces were pale. Everyone was shocked. At the moment when the two divine powers collided, they had a very real feeling, as if the god of death had arrived. Was the strength of a false god so terrifying? If not for Yigleo's protection, they would have all died in that instant. After one round of confrontation, the state preceptor's gaze turned completely cold. He looked at Yigleo and said, "You shouldn't have interfered with Qin Feiyang's affairs." Boom! The imperial tutor's aura completely erupted, like a huge wave, madly pouncing towards Yigleo. "Are you trying to scare me?" Yigleo smiled coldly, and the pressure of a fake god surged out like a tsunami. For a moment, he was on par with the imperial advisor, but deep in Yigleo's eyes, there was a trace of worry. He transmitted his voice, "You have to think of a way to stall him." "What is it?" Qin Feiyang and the others were shocked. "My strength is on par with the imperial preceptor. Normally, I wouldn't be afraid of him at all. But now I have to focus on reviving the space-time gate. The space-time gate is a divine artifact. To revive it would require almost all of my divine power. That's why I can't fight him now." Yigleo transmitted his voice. Everyone's eyes darkened. This was really bad news. Dong Zhenyang secretly said, "Qin Feiyang, Lu Xingqian, why don't we go to your divine artifact?" "No. In our divine artifact, the space-time gate is the same as the teleportation gate. They can't be teleported, because our divine artifact is also a divine artifact. It can cut off the space-time gate from the outside world." Lu Xingqian said, "Lu Xingqian is right. We have to think of another way." Yigleo also nodded without leaving a trace. Hearing this, everyone's heart fell to the bottom. Shinmei suddenly said, "Why don't we go to the castle to hide first?" "Yes. Although we can't escape, we can at least share some of the pressure with Yigleo. Let's wait for him to revive the space-time gate before we come out," Dong Zhenyang suggested. "I think you're scared, silly. If we enter the castle, won't he stop Yigleo from reviving the space-time gate?" "Is he that stupid?" Lu Xingqian rolled his eyes at him. Dong Zhenyang was also a little annoyed. He frowned and said, "Then what do you think we should do?" Lu Xingqian shook his head and said, "I don't have a choice. We can only rely on Qin Feiyang now." Hearing this, everyone looked at Qin Feiyang in unison. Looking at everyone, Qin Feiyang fell into a struggle and self-blame. If he could keep an eye on the commander of the Kirin army and not give him a chance to betray them, they wouldn't be in this situation at all. What should they do now? Hand over Changshui and the castle? But he couldn't do it. Besides, even if he did, the state preceptor might not keep his promise and let everyone go. At this moment, everyone was at a loss. But there was one person who was very calm. She was Qin Feiyang's mother. She glanced at everyone and then looked at Qin Feiyang. A gentle light flashed in her eyes. Then, she took a step forward and stood in front of Yigleo. The two divine powers that were fighting tore her body apart in an instant. Blood gushed out. This sudden change was not only unexpected by Qin Feiyang and the others, but also by the state preceptor and Yigleo. One had to know. Now the divine powers of the fake gods were clashing. Running out like this was simply courting death. "Mother." When Qin Feiyang saw this scene, he suddenly turned pale with horror and rushed to the woman in white without hesitation. Yigleo and the state preceptor also came to their senses and withdrew their divine powers at the same time. Bang! The woman in white turned to look at Qin Feiyang. Her body was stained with blood, which was tragic and beautiful, and her eyes were unprecedentedly bright and clear. There was a trace of relief, as well as an apology and encouragement to Qin Feiyang. It was as if she was saying to Qin Feiyang, "I'm sorry, I can't accompany you in the future. You must live well." Then she slowly fell to the ground. When she fell to the ground, there was no blame or injustice on her blood-stained face. There was only a bright smile. That smile was brighter than the sun, enough to make the world pale. "Mother!" Qin Feiyang quickly rushed forward and hugged his mother in his arms. Looking at his mother's broken body and her beautiful face, his heart felt like it was being twisted by a knife. He was in so much pain that he wanted to die. Yiglao said, "She's not dead yet. Maybe she can still be saved. Quickly give her the heart protection pill, spirit sea pill, and essence soul pill." That's right. Although it was only a moment before, although the woman in white's cultivation was also very strong, Yiglao and Yiglao were both fake gods. Under the fake god realm, all living beings were like ants. The divine power of the two not only tore her body, but also shattered her sea of qi, sea of consciousness, and internal organs. It could even be said that there was not a single place that was intact. It was also because the injuries were too serious that Yiglao said that maybe she can be saved. What he meant was that the chances were not high. In the blink of an eye, hearing Qin Feiyang's words, Qin Feiyang immediately entered the castle and looked at Fatso anxiously. "Quickly give me the pill. Use it. It can definitely pull Annie back from the gates of hell." Fatso pointed to the space above the altar where the 6-word divine art was placed. There, a cluster of green flames floated. It was the size of a palm and exuded a majestic vitality. Qin Feiyang looked up and his eyes immediately lit up with ecstasy. He nodded and said, "Yes, use it." This cluster of flames was the 3rd cluster of fire of life he had obtained. Back then, when he and Fatso were seriously injured, they had fused with the first 2 clusters of fire of life to escape the calamity. And this time, it would definitely work too. He grabbed the fire of life and appeared beside his mother. Boundless life energy instantly filled every corner of the prison cell. This is fire of life. The Grand Tutor and Yiglao's eyes widened, greed crawling up their old faces. The Grand Tutor immediately released a trace of pressure and pounced toward Qin Feiyang, wanting to snatch the fire of life. Qin Feiyang glanced at the Grand Tutor coldly and said to Yiglao, "If you don't help me, our cooperation ends here." Yiglao raised his eyebrows. He waved his hand and a pressure emerged, condensing an invisible barrier in front of Qin Feiyang, blocking the Grand Tutor's pressure. "You really like to meddle in other people's business." The Grand Tutor was completely furious. He placed both hands in front of his chest and formed seals with lightning speed. An aura that could destroy heaven and earth roared out from his hands. This was a battle art. Yiglao's eyes darkened and said, "It seems that this battle is unavoidable. You guys go to the castle immediately." As he spoke, he decisively put away the gate of time and space. As long as the Grand Tutor did not stop, he would not be able to revive the gate of time and space. It would be better to fight first and see whose wrist was harder. Qin Feiyang also finally placed the fire of life into his mother's mouth. Immediately, that terrifying life force surged towards the white-clothed woman's limbs and bones like a tide. The wounds all over her body immediately began to heal at a speed visible to the naked eye. Seeing that his mother's condition was gradually stabilizing, Qin Feiyang finally heaved a sigh of relief. Shua! Suddenly, he stood up and stared at the Grand Tutor, saying, "Although my mother is no longer the Empress, she is still the Emperor's wife. How dare you hurt her?" "Hurt her? Let me tell you, if you don't hand over Changshui and the castle today, don't mention hurting her, I will kill her." The Grand Tutor laughed sinisterly, looking quite ferocious. "How dare you?" But at this moment, a loud and clear voice resounded in the prison of gods. It was filled with a majestic aura. "Your Majesty!" The Grand Tutor's body trembled, and he quickly turned around to see a middle-aged man standing in the corridor in front of him. This man wore a dragon crown on his head and a dragon robe on his body. His whole body was surrounded by golden light, exuding a vast aura. His face was cold, and his eyes were full of spirit. That 7-feet-tall body was like an unreachable giant mountain. An invisible pressure covered the sky and covered the earth. Even the Grand Tutor, who was a false god, could not help but lower his head, looking extremely respectful. "Greetings, Your Majesty." The Grand Tutor bowed. The Emperor took a step forward, and every step seemed steady and powerful. Beside the Emperor, there was a middle-aged man in purple armor, who was the commander of the Kirin army. Obviously, the Emperor was called by the commander of the Kirin army. The Grand Tutor glanced at the Emperor, and then looked at the commander of the Kirin army, with a faint cold light in his eyes. At the same time, the old lord and the others in the cell listened to the approaching footsteps and held their breaths. But Qin Feiyang's eyes were full of disgust. A few seconds later, the Emperor finally reached the door of the cell and turned around to look at Qin Feiyang and the others. "Greetings, Your Majesty." The old lord and the others knelt down and kowtowed. Lu Xingqian frowned, but in the end he also knelt on the ground. Only Qin Feiyang and Yiglao did not do anything. Yiglao was a false god, and he was not a subject of the great Qin Empire, so he did not need to kowtow. As for Qin Feiyang, he only hated the Emperor, so of course he would not kowtow. Chapter 912. Suddenly, the Emperor looked at the woman in white lying on the ground. His expression changed slightly, and he hurried over. "Get lost!" Qin Feiyang raised his eyebrows and directly stood in front of his mother. The Emperor stopped in front of Qin Feiyang and said, "You are your mother, but you are also my imperial concubine. I have the right to care about her. Don't cry crocodile tears here. If you really care about my mother, why didn't you come to see her all these years? Do you know how my mother survived all these years in the god's prison? Care? What a ridiculous word. Your ruthlessness and indifference have completely made me give up. Get lost! Instead of coming here to put on an act, you might as well go back and accompany your youngest son." Qin Feiyang looked at him coldly, determined not to give in. The Emperor frowned and said, "You know all about it?" "It's not a secret. However, I have something to tell you. Although the name Jiang Haoyan has been abandoned by me, it is not something that can be replaced by anyone." Qin Feiyang said word by word, and his eyes flashed with a shocking cold light. The Emperor's pupils shrank and said, "I'm warning you, don't hurt him." "Haha, you're defending him now. It seems that you really care about him. If killing him can make you suffer, it's worth a try." Qin Feiyang joked. Whoosh! The Emperor's arm shot out and grabbed Qin Feiyang's neck. He said in a deep voice, "If you dare to touch a single hair of his, I will kill you with my own hands." "Then do it now. You've always wanted to kill me anyway, haven't you?" Qin Feiyang looked at him indifferently. There was no fear in his eyes, only coldness. A bone-piercing coldness. The Emperor looked at him deeply, and finally let go of his big hand. He pushed Qin Feiyang away and bent down to pick up the woman in white. "Put her down." Qin Feiyang was extremely angry. Like a mad beast, he madly pounced towards the Emperor. Boom! A powerful aura rushed out from the Emperor's body, and Qin Feiyang was sent flying. He crashed into a wall and coughed up blood. "Don't challenge my bottom line again," the Emperor said without turning his head. Then he carried the woman out of the cell. "Your Majesty, allow me." The commander of the Kirin army stepped forward and looked at the unconscious woman in white. "No need." Then he looked at the imperial advisor and said, "Did you just say that you want to kill her?" The imperial preceptor's gaze trembled as he hurriedly said, "Your Majesty, this is a misunderstanding. Let me explain. I don't want to pursue what you've done behind my back all these years. We only have one order. Release them immediately." Di Wang said, "Your Majesty, you can't." When the state preceptor heard this, he immediately became anxious. "What is it? Now, you even dare to disobey my orders?" The emperor's gaze turned cold as he shouted, "I don't dare." The imperial advisor hurriedly lowered his head and said, "Your Majesty, we can release the others, but Qin Feiyang." Qin Feiyang murdered the prince. He has committed a heinous crime. Lock him up in the penitentiary and wait for my orders. As for the person from the Forgotten Continent, expel him immediately. Commander, you stay and accompany the imperial advisor." The emperor said expressionlessly. After that, he ignored the imperial advisor and strode away with the woman in white in his arms. "Yes, Your Majesty." The commander of the Kirin army bowed to the emperor's back as he left. "Farewell, Your Majesty." The imperial advisor also hurriedly bowed to see the emperor off, but his old face was ashen. "Give my mother back to me," however, at this moment. Qin Feiyang rushed out of the cell and roared hysterically. His eyes were bloodshot. The commander of the Kirin army grabbed him and said, "Calm down. His Majesty won't hurt the queen. It's all because of you that we're in this situation. I'm going to kill you." Qin Feiyang suddenly turned around and stared at the commander of the Kirin army with a cruel smile on his face. "Stop." Lu Xingqian saw that the situation was bad and hurriedly tried to persuade him. "Although the commander of the Kirin army betrayed you, he also saved your mother. If he hadn't called the emperor over, your mother might have been killed by the imperial advisor. From this, it can be seen that he still has some feelings for you. Moreover, if you kill him now, the imperial advisor will have a reason to kill you first and report to the emperor later. After all, killing the commander of the Kirin army isn't a small matter." Hearing Lu Xingqian's words, Qin Feiyang finally calmed down. The commander of the Kirin army also secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Then he looked at Yiglao and cupped his hands. "Your Excellency, please leave the great Qin Empire immediately." Yiglao was a false god. If he wanted to leave, no one in the great Qin Empire could stop him. Therefore, it was better to just let him go. Yiglao frowned and looked at Qin Feiyang, then at Lu Xingqian, and finally at the imperial advisor. If the imperial advisor wasn't here, he could take everyone and leave. But now he had to abandon Qin Feiyang and the others. Clang! He took out the space-time gate again and poured his divine power into it. The commander of the Kirin army looked at the space-time gate with a serious expression. Although he didn't know what the space-time gate was used for, it wasn't difficult to judge from the divine power it emitted that it was a teleportation divine artifact. And it was a divine artifact that could be used to escape. Otherwise, this old man wouldn't have tried to revive so many times. He looked at the old man and the others and said, "All of you come out and stand behind the imperial advisor." He did this to prevent Yiglao from escaping with everyone after opening the space-time gate. The old man and the others looked at each other and walked out of the cell one after another. They stood behind Qin Feiyang and the others. A dozen breaths passed, accompanied by a deafening sound. The space-time gate finally opened. Yiglao wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at Qin Feiyang. He said, "Call Mu Qing out." Qin Feiyang waved his hand, and Mu Qing suddenly appeared out of thin air. As soon as Mu Qing came out, she looked at Lu Xingqian and frowned. There was also a questioning look in her eyes. However, Lu Xingqian didn't say anything, but it was unknown if he secretly transmitted his voice. Yiglao said, "Qing, let's go." "Okay." Mu Qing nodded and walked toward Yiglao. At the same time, she transmitted her voice to Qin Feiyang without looking back. "Don't worry, we'll come back to save you soon." "Save me?" Qin Feiyang was stunned and secretly said, Are you sure you can deal with the Imperial Advisor and the Emperor? Mu Qing didn't respond, but when he walked to the space-time gate, he suddenly transmitted his voice. I'm not sure, but I can think of a way. After that, Mu Qing and Yigleo both stepped into the space-time gate and disappeared from everyone's sight in the blink of an eye. Then, even the space-time gate disappeared. Save me, Qin Feiyang was confused. Logically speaking, now that he had fallen into the hands of the Emperor, Mu Qing should have given up on him. But why did she still want to save him? Just because of the heavenly dipper flame? But didn't the Mu family also arrange for others to sneak into the Pill Pagoda? Even without him, it wouldn't be difficult to snatch the heavenly dipper flame. Taking a step back, even if those people arranged by the Mu family failed to snatch the heavenly dipper flame, wasn't there still Mu Qing's second grandpa? This person had been hiding in the Pill Pagoda for so many years and was still a divine envoy. If he made a move, there would be no suspense at all. So, now, the Mu family didn't need to come to the imperial capital to save him at all. Could it be that, in the eyes of the Mu family, he still had other value? Hurry up and go in. Just as Qin Feiyang was pondering, the imperial advisor suddenly made a move and pushed Qin Feiyang's back with force. Qin Feiyang immediately followed the inertia and ran uncontrollably toward the cell. This move made the old master and the others' faces change color. You know, the thunder tribulation in the cell was still there, and Yigleo had already left. Without the protection of the divine enchantment, Qin Feiyang would instantly die under the thunder tribulation if he entered the cell. At this critical moment, Ren Wushuang quickly rushed forward and pulled Qin Feiyang back again. Qin Feiyang also came back to his senses. His whole body was immediately dripping with cold sweat. Whoosh! He suddenly turned around and looked at the imperial advisor. The murderous intent in his eyes was undisguised. This old bastard, he actually wanted to harm him. If it wasn't for Ren Wushuang's timely move, he was afraid that he would have been smashed into pieces by the thunder tribulation. Not even his bones would be left. Imperial advisor, did you do it on purpose? The commander of the Kirin army also frowned and looked at the imperial advisor. How dare you? Do you know who you are talking to? The imperial advisor suddenly shouted with a stern voice. That gloomy look in his eyes was as if he was looking at a dead person. Extremely frightening. Previously, he was already very angry when the commander of the Kirin army called the emperor over and ruined his plans. Now, the commander of the Kirin army was questioning him in public, which made him very angry. I'm sorry. The commander of the Kirin army quickly lowered his head, his face full of fear. You're on your own. The imperial advisor snorted coldly, his words full of threat. Then he glanced at Qin Feiyang and turned to leave the prison of God. Phew! When the imperial advisor completely disappeared from sight, the commander of the Kirin army heaved a long sigh of relief. Lu Xingqian withdrew his gaze and whispered, Brother Qin, you have to be careful. This old bastard will definitely do something to you again. I know. Qin Feiyang nodded. Ren Wushuang looked at Qin Feiyang worriedly and said, Feiyang, you shouldn't have come back this time. Yes, now we can go out, but you are locked in again. The old man sighed. Qin Feiyang looked at the two of them and said with a smile, Don't worry, I'll be fine. It's not like we don't know the situation in the prison of God. How can we not worry? The old man rolled his eyes at Qin Feiyang and then looked at the commander of the Kirin army. He bowed and said, Sir, can you remove the thunder tribulation in the cell? No, but it can reduce the power of the thunder tribulation. The commander of the Kirin army shook his head. This, the old man frowned. Lu Xingqian smiled and said, Grandpa Rin, don't worry. This guy has the castle. The thunder tribulation can't hurt him at all. Yes. The old man was suddenly enlightened. Qin Feiyang could enter the castle to avoid the bombardment of the thunder tribulation. However, the commander of the Kirin army frowned, but he didn't say anything. He looked at the old man and the others and said with a smile, "Wait for me at the door. I have a few words to say to His Highness in private." Everyone nodded, but they didn't leave immediately. They all looked at Qin Feiyang. Qin Feiyang waved his hand and said with a smile, "It's just the prison of God. It's no big deal. Don't worry." Lu Xingqian was stunned for a moment before he smiled bitterly and said, "Only a guy like you can say something like that here." After that, he shook his head and turned to leave. "Shuang, let's go too." The old man patted Ren Wushuang's shoulder. Ren Wushuang looked at Qin Feiyang and said, "You must survive." Qin Feiyang nodded heavily. Then the old man pulled Ren Wushuang and turned to leave. "Take care." Dong Xingyang and the others also cupped their hands to Qin Feiyang. There was a trace of gratitude in their eyes. If Qin Feiyang hadn't appeared, they didn't know how long they would have been locked up. They might not even be able to leave the prison of God for the rest of their lives. "Take care." Qin Feiyang also smiled at them. They left one after another. Chapter 9:13. Qin Feiyang said, "What do you want to say? Just say it." No matter what, it was the commander of the Kirin army's fault that he ended up in this situation. He was not a saint, so he could not let it go. The commander of the Kirin army asked cautiously, "Can this slave seal? You want me to lift the slave seal?" "Do you think it's possible?" Qin Feiyang pursed his lips into a cold smile. "Why not? Before this, there was no personal grudge between us." The commander of the Kirin army said unwillingly. Qin Feiyang said, "Anyone who is loyal to the emperor is my enemy." The commander of the Kirin army said angrily, "Don't you know that's too extreme? The emperor did let you down, but he didn't really kill you. What do you know? Back then, when I was expelled from the imperial palace, if it weren't for my mother who begged for mercy for me, I would have been killed by him." Qin Feiyang shouted. The commander of the Kirin army heard this and could not help but feel helpless. Of course, he also knew about this, but there was a saying that it was better to squash enmity than to keep it alive. Moreover, the two of them were father and son, and blood was thicker than water. Was it necessary to fight like this? The commander of the Kirin army did not say anything more and asked, "Can the slave seal really control my soul?" "Do you think I'm bluffing? Okay, I'll let you have a taste of your soul being crushed." Qin Feiyang's eyes flashed with a cold light, and his mind moved slightly. The commander of the Kirin army suddenly held his head and screamed. At this very moment, he truly felt as if his soul was about to shatter. The intense pain caused his face to twist and distort. "Stop, stop, stop!" He hurriedly waved his hand. If Qin Feiyang did not stop, his soul would definitely be crushed. No, it was crushed. Qin Feiyang looked at him coldly and stopped operating the slave seal. The commander of the Qilin army immediately sensed that the intense pain had disappeared. Don't even think about asking the imperial preceptor or the emperor to help you remove the slave seal, because they don't have the ability to do so. In this world, only I can remove it. Qin Feiyang said lightly. The commander of the Kirin army turned pale. "Looks like I won't be able to escape from this kid's evil clutches in this lifetime." He sighed deeply and said, "I heard from Wan Qiu that you were the one who kidnapped the phantom serpent emperor." "Yes." Qin Feiyang nodded. "I should have known that the only person in the great Qin Empire who has the guts to barge into my governor's manor is you." The commander of the Kirin army said bitterly. Qin Feiyang glanced at him and asked, "Did you kill Wan Qiu?" "No. I wanted to kill him, but my daughter, speaking of which." The commander of the Kirin army furrowed his brows and felt an indescribable sense of irritation. Sometimes, don't worry too much and cut the Gordian knot. Qin Feiyang said with killing intent surging in his eyes. The commander of the Kirin army narrowed his eyes and frowned. "What kind of person is Wan Qiu?" "A villain." Qin Feiyang snorted disdainfully and asked, "Do you have any other questions?" The commander of the Kirin army shook his head. He just wanted to remove the slave seal. But Qin Feiyang obviously wouldn't let him do so. Qin Feiyang waved his hand and said, "If you don't have any more questions, then leave." The commander of the Kirin army looked at him and wanted to say something. But in the end, he didn't say anything and walked towards the door in disappointment. Qin Feiyang frowned and pondered for a while. He looked at the back of the commander of the Kirin army and said, "Don't say I didn't give you a chance. Help me keep an eye on my mother, and take care of the old man and the others. As long as you can do it, I may remove your slave seal in the future." After that, Qin Feiyang looked away and turned to look at the cell filled with thunder tribulations. Hearing this, the commander of the Kirin army trembled, and there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. After the commander of the Kirin army left, a black figure walked into the penitentiary. It was the black-robed old man who was guarding the door and suddenly asked for Qin Feiyang's name when he entered the penitentiary. The commander of the Kirin army called him ancestor, so he must have a high status in the imperial palace. But Qin Feiyang had never seen this man before. "I didn't expect that I, who had been wise all my life, would let a little bastard like you sneak into the penitentiary." The black-robed old man walked towards Qin Feiyang and said coldly. Qin Feiyang raised his eyebrows and looked at the black-robed old man. He said, "Did you eat feces? Why is your mouth so smelly?" The black-robed old man's body stiffened, and his old eyes were filled with anger. He said in a deep voice, "Little bastard, I dare you to say that again." Qin Feiyang sneered. "I think not only did you eat feces, but you also didn't have a mother to teach you. You're courting death." The black-robed old man stepped out and instantly landed in front of Qin Feiyang. He raised his old hand and directly hit Qin Feiyang's face. Qin Feiyang smiled disdainfully and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. The black-robed old man suddenly blew his beard and glared. He shouted, "Little bastard, come out and fight me one-on-one if you have the guts. Don't hide in the castle like a coward." Is this old man stupid? Inside the castle, Fatso and the others looked at each other. A 9-star combat emperor asked a 9-star combat master to fight him one-on-one. Was his head kicked by a donkey? Wolf King asked, "Little Qin Zi, are you really going to stay in this damned place forever?" "What else?" Qin Feiyang asked. Wolf King raised his eyebrows and said worriedly, "If we don't think of a way to leave this place, we will definitely die." Not to mention the emperor, even the imperial advisor would not let them go. Moreover, from the black-robed old man's attitude towards Qin Feiyang, it could be expected that he should also be one of the imperial advisor's men. In short, staying here would not end well. Qin Feiyang glanced at everyone and said with a smile, "Don't worry, someone won't let us die." "Who?" Wolf King was surprised. Before Mu Qing left, what he said to Qin Feiyang was through a secret sound transmission. So not only did the imperial advisor and the others not know, even Wolf King and the others did not know. Mu family. Qin Feiyang's eyes flickered. This Wolf King, Fatso, and the others looked at each other, their eyes full of suspicion. They really couldn't think of a reason why the Mu family would come to save them. Lu Hong said, "Is it because of the heavenly thunder flame, the ice flame, and the mysterious sky flame?" Qin Feiyang was stunned. When he was thinking about this problem before, he ignored these 3 flames. Now that Lu Hong reminded him, he remembered that to summon and open that miracle, he needed to gather 10 clusters of flames. And now there are 3 clusters of flames in his hands. If the Mu family doesn't save him, then even if the Mu family gets the heavenly thunder flame, they can't enter the miracle. At this point, Qin Feiyang laughed. Sure enough, there is always a way out. He also looked forward to it. How is the Mu family going to save him? You know, It's not a simple matter to snatch people from the hands of the imperial advisor and the emperor. Forgotten continent, Black Cloud Mountain. Above the top of the mountain stood two figures, one old and one young. It's Mu Qing and Yigleo. Both of them lowered their heads and remained silent. They seemed to be rather anxious. A moment later, Mu Qing clenched his hands, looked up at Yigleo and said in a deep voice, "No matter what, we must save Qin Feiyang." "It's not easy." Yigleo shook his head. "As long as the imperial advisor is still in the imperial capital, it's almost impossible to save him. I thought of a person. If she's willing to help, plus you, the great ancestor, and the second ancestor, saving Qin Feiyang shouldn't be a problem." Mu Qing said. "Who?" Yigleo was stunned, looked at Mu Qing and asked. "That mysterious lady." Mu Qing said, his eyes bursting with radiance. Yigleo's heart moved and nodded. Maybe it's really possible, after all, her strength is still a mystery. But this person's whereabouts are mysterious. How can we find her? Spread out and dissipate. Just say that Qin Feiyang is in trouble. If she really has something to do with Qin Feiyang, she will naturally come to us. Mu Qing said. Yigleo frowned. But what if she and Qin Feiyang are just using their relationship and doesn't care about Qin Feiyang's life at all? Then we'll think of another way. You don't have to worry about this. Leave it to me, Mu Qing said. Well, I'll go back and recover my divine power. Let me know if there's any news. By the way, when you spread out and dissipate, don't reveal that we've been to the great Qin Empire. Yigleo reminded. I understand. Mu Qing nodded. Then the two of them went their separate ways. In less than half a day, the news of Qin Feiyang's death spread in the central divine kingdom. But the news only said that Qin Feiyang had died. For example, how Qin Feiyang had died and where he had died were not mentioned. There was no suspense. When this news came out, it caused a huge uproar in the central divine kingdom. The chief tower master immediately ordered Gongsun Bei to bring the various god envoys to find the person who spread the news. And the next day, like a plague, the news of Qin Feiyang's death quickly spread through the 9 great regions again. The person who spread the news was naturally Mu Qing. Although the central divine kingdom and the 9 regions' teleportation altars were guarded, Mu Qing had a replica of the spatial gate, so there was no need to go through the teleportation altars. For a time, everywhere in the Forgotten Continent, a storm was brewing. The great Qin Empire was the same. The imperial capital. In a certain mountain range, a white-haired old man stood on top of a mountain and looked in the direction of the imperial capital. He wore a pure white robe, and his white hair fluttered in the wind, giving off an otherworldly aura. Whoosh! Not long after, a light figure came from afar and landed in front of the white-haired old man. It was a middle-aged man with sharp eyebrows and a sharp aura. He wore a flaming armor, and there was a Kirin pattern on his chest. That's right. He was from the Kirin army. If Qin Feiyang was here, he would definitely recognize that this Kirin army was Jiang Qianqing. The white-haired old man looked at Jiang Qianqing and asked, "How's the situation?" "Not good. Everyone else was released, but he was locked in the divine prison." Jiang Qianqing said. The white-haired old man's face darkened slightly, and he said, "Tell me the details." According to what I heard, Jiang Qianqing was now from the Kirin army, so it was naturally very easy for him to get information. He knew everything that had happened to Qin Feiyang in the divine prison. Chapter 9:14. Jiang Qianqing asked, "Then what do you plan to do?" "I'm not doing anything." The white-haired old man shook his head. Jiang Qianqing was surprised. The white-haired old man didn't explain. He waved his hand and said, "Go back and continue to monitor the movements of the imperial capital. If there are any abnormalities, report to me immediately." "Okay." Jiang Qianqing nodded. "Wait." The white-haired old man suddenly thought of something and asked, Have you investigated the situation of the Zhuge family? It's still under investigation, Jiang Qianqing said. The white-haired old man said, Be quick. I have a feeling that the Zhuge family is not normal. Understood. Jiang Qianqing nodded and then turned to leave. At this moment, it was almost evening. The white-haired old man stood alone at the top of the mountain and looked at the setting sun in the sky. He muttered, I really want to see how you will treat your own son. Similarly, in an extremely remote place in the Great Qin Empire, there was a stretch of undulating mountain range here. Mountain stream. The vegetation was lush and the rivers were dense. Wild beasts were galloping in the forest, but there was no fighting here. It was extremely peaceful, and at the bottom of one of the giant peaks sat a village. The village occupied an area of about half a mile, and there were thousands of families gathered here. The houses in the village were all built with very ordinary wood, and in front of the village there was a large field of rice and vegetable gardens. The golden rice swayed in the wind, making the ground seem like it was covered with a layer of dazzling gold leaf. Those emerald green vegetables were like slender and elegant young girls, exuding vitality and youth. Although it was almost evening, many farmers were still busy in the rice fields, catching insects and weeding. They all had simple smiles on their faces. Groups of youths gathered in twos and threes, rolling around in the mud and having fun. Her small face was also filled with an innocent smile. The slightly older children gathered around some of the elders and watched them play chess. And the women of each family were either cooking in the house or picking fresh vegetables in the garden to prepare dinner. Green smoke curled up in the sky above the village, showing a peaceful scene. As for their attire, they were all very ordinary. Some of them even had layers of patches on their clothes. In front of one of the wooden buildings, a white-haired old man was sitting on a stool, surrounded by a group of 13 to 14-year-old boys and girls. The old man was dressed in sackcloth and had an amiable expression. He was telling the story of the mountain. A group of young boys and girls squatted on the ground and listened attentively. Occasionally, they would exclaim in surprise, "Whoosh! Soon!" Accompanied by the sound of something breaking through the air, a burly man cut through the sky and flew towards the village. This person's upper body was naked. His muscles were well developed, and his skin was very dark as if it was smeared with charcoal. It was the same for his face. However, seeing the burly man flying in the sky, no one in the village was surprised. It was as if he was used to it. The sackcloth old man also raised his head and looked at the burly man with a smile on his old face. Next, he retracted his gaze and looked at the surrounding young boys and girls. He smiled and said, "Your Uncle Black is back. Let's end today's story here. Second Grandpa, we haven't heard enough yet. Please tell us more." A young boy with mud on his small face ran to the side of the sackcloth old man and pulled his arm. He acted like a spoiled child. "You little brat." The sackcloth old man lightly knocked on the young boy's forehead and said dotingly, "Telling a story is the same as being a person. You have to take it step by step. If you finish it in one go, then it won't be interesting. Do you understand?" The young boy nodded his head as if he understood. Schwa! The burly man landed behind the group of young boys and revealed a simple smile. He scolded, "You little brats, pestering your second grandpa every day. Don't you know that your second grandpa is already old and needs to rest?" A young girl put her hands on her waist and revealed a pair of small canine teeth. She said, "Uncle Black, we don't agree with your words." Yes. The other young boys all stood up and stared at the burly man with dissatisfaction. "Oh, then tell me, why don't you agree?" The burly man looked at them with interest. "Second grandpa isn't as old as you say." "Yes. Our second grandpa will definitely live to 100 years old." The group of young boys started to chatter. The burly man shook his head and laughed. He stretched out his hand and said, "All right. Be good and go home. I still have some business to discuss with your second grandpa." One of the young boys asked curiously, "Then tell us first. Is the outside world fun?" "It is." The burly man nodded and smiled. "What fun things are there? Hurry up and tell us. If you don't tell us, we'll stay here and not leave." The group of young boys immediately surrounded the burly man with anticipation on their faces. "Yo, you little brats dare to threaten me? Just you wait. See if I don't smack your little buttocks." The burly man let out a strange cry and revealed a ferocious look. He stretched out his hand to grab a young boy. "Uncle Black is hitting someone. Run. Save me." The group of young boys immediately scattered. As they ran, they howled and made funny faces at the burly man. When the nearby villagers saw this scene, they couldn't help but find it funny. The sackcloth old man also looked at the young boys with a face full of affection. When the young boys ran far away, he retracted his gaze and looked at the burly man. He asked, "How was it?" The burly man's face suddenly darkened. He walked to the side of the sackcloth old man and whispered a few words in the old man's ear. Crack! After the sackcloth old man heard this, his calloused hands suddenly clenched tightly. Moreover, his originally benevolent face also revealed a trace of shocking ruthlessness. But soon these negative emotions disappeared and he returned to his previous state. "What should we do?" the burly man asked. "The situation has developed to this point. We can no longer sit by and do nothing. Immediately call Lu Zheng here." The sackcloth old man pondered for a while. A determined light flashed in his old eyes as he said in a low voice, "Zhang, quickly come and see your second grandpa." The burly man nodded and turned to the mountain outside the village and shouted. His voice was like a bell, resounding in all directions. "Uncle Black, I'll be right back." The next moment, in the distant mountain, a loud and clear echo resounded. In less than 100 breaths, a young man with dark skin covered in blood flew towards the village while carrying a ferocious beast. The young man's figure was tall and straight, about 8 meters. His upper body was exposed, and he only wore a pair of large pants made of animal skin. The ferocious beast on his shoulder was a bull. Its body was more than 10 meters long. There was a fatal wound where its heart was, and it was still bleeding. Although this bull was dead, there was still a trace of aura left on its body. And this aura was a trace of holy aura. This was enough to prove that the bull was a holy beast. Brother Zheng is back. Wow, it's a big beast. We'll have barbecue tonight. When the young boys in the village saw the young man, their faces were full of admiration. Bang! Lu Zheng landed at the entrance of the village and casually threw the bull on the ground. More than a dozen young boys playing at the entrance of the village immediately rushed towards him. "Brother Zheng, when you go hunting tomorrow, can you take me with you?" Me too. I want to play with those beasts too." A few of the young boys grabbed Lu Zheng's hand and chattered. The other youths surrounded the barbarian bull and exclaimed in surprise. There were even 2 7- or 8-year-old children who were not afraid of the holy aura. They climbed onto the bull and touched it here and there. Their big eyes were full of curiosity. "Not now. You're still young. When you grow up, Brother Zheng will definitely take you hunting, okay?" Lu Zheng looked at the youths in front of him. His sharp aura was restrained, and he looked like an ordinary youth. A simple smile appeared on his mature face. "We'll have to wait a long time for us to grow up. Brother Zheng, just take me with you. I promise I'll listen to you." A young boy raised his hand and made a solemn vow. "Little brat." Lu Zheng rubbed the young boy's head, then looked at the old man in sackcloth and the burly man. Although the old man in sackcloth and the burly man looked the same as usual, he sharply noticed that there was something wrong with their expressions. Did something happen in the imperial capital again? He muttered to himself and looked at the group of young boys in front of him. He smiled and said, "All right, go and play. Brother Zheng still has things to do." With that, Lu Zheng turned into a stream of light and quickly landed in front of the old man in sackcloth and the burly man. He chuckled and said, "Why are you in such a hurry to call me back?" The burly man looked at the bloodstains on Lu Zheng's body and said unhappily, "Didn't I tell you again and again to wash off the bloodstains on your body before coming back from hunting? If those children see you like this, it will affect their state of mind. Do you know that?" Lu Zheng felt wronged and said, "Didn't you tell me to come back immediately?" "You're still quibbling?" The burly man's face stiffened. Lu Zheng waved his hand impatiently and said, all right, stop talking. I was wrong, okay? Tell me, what's the matter?" The burly man glared at him, then looked at the old man in sackcloth. The old man in sackcloth looked at Lu Zheng and asked, "Zheng, do you know Qin Feiyang?" Lu Zheng pursed his lips and said, "Isn't he that good-for-nothing little cousin? Of course I know." "Good for nothing?" The burly man's face darkened and he said angrily, "Tell me, how is he good for nothing?" TCH, if he was a good for nothing, he wouldn't have been beaten so badly by the emperor. Lu Zheng said, "Nonsense. He's alone. How can he beat the current emperor? If it were you, you'd be crying for your parents by now." The burly man rolled his eyes at him fiercely. "So what if he's the emperor?" Lu Zheng waved his hand disdainfully. "All right, stop quarreling. Zheng, go to the imperial capital immediately and help your little cousin if you have the chance. It hasn't been easy for him all these years, and our Lu family should think of a way to do something for him." The old man in sackcloth sighed. "What?" Lu Zheng raised his eyebrows and said, "Second Grandpa, you have to think about it carefully. If we become enemies with the emperor now, it won't do us any good." "I know. So, you have to hide your identity well. Even if it's Feiyang, you have to hide it from him for the time being. Don't be impulsive no matter what happens. It's best to send me a message first," the old man in sackcloth instructed. Lu Zheng frowned and nodded. "All right, I was just about to go out for a walk. Shall I go now? Be careful," the old man in sackcloth reminded him. "Don't worry. With me, there's nothing I can't handle." Chapter 9:15. It's my Lu family's fault. After Lu Zheng left, the linen old man looked at the sky. A trace of self-blame crept up in his old eyes. Seeing this, the burly man beside him could not help but let out a long sigh. His expression was full of helplessness. In the blink of an eye, 5 days passed. The 9th region of the Forgotten Continent. Ice Crystal City. Heavy snow swirled in the air, cold wind howled. The mountains and rivers presented a snow-white world. Inside the city, Purple Cloud House. Back then, Qin Feiyang met the imperial tutor at this Purple Cloud House. And the Purple Cloud House was the closest restaurant to the teleportation altar in the entire Ice Crystal City. The exchange was also nearby. In addition to the cold weather, when they were free, everyone liked to drink a few cups to warm their bodies. Therefore, there were more people gathered here than in other restaurants. Among these people, there were hunters. There were rich people. Of course, there were also people from the big tribes. The main hall of the restaurant. Dozens of tables were neatly arranged, but most of the guests were in the private rooms upstairs. In the main hall, there were only a dozen tables of guests, and it seemed a bit lonely. And in a corner, a black-clothed youth sat alone at the table, drinking by himself. But while drinking, his gaze always swept towards the entrance of the Purple Cloud House. Every guest that came in and out, he would carefully size them up a few times. The black-clothed youth had been sitting here for a few days, as if he was waiting for someone. From the beginning to the end, he did not say a word. The waiters of the restaurant were already used to it, but every time they saw the black-clothed youth or passed by him, they would be suspicious. What was wrong with this person? In the evening, a group of young people in luxurious clothes entered the Purple Cloud House. There were men and women. They were all famous disciples of the Ice Crystal City, or young talents of the big tribes. They were frequent customers of the Purple Cloud House. Basically, every night they would come here to have fun. Therefore, they also knew about the black-clothed youth situation. When they saw that the black-clothed youth was still sitting here alone, their expressions were quite strange. A purple-clothed youth slowly walked to the black-clothed youth's table, smiled, and asked, "Brother, seeing that you've been here for a few days, is there something bothering you?" The black-clothed youth raised his head and looked at this person, but only smiled slightly, did not say anything, raised his wine cup and drank by himself. Seeing this, the purple-clothed young man didn't ask for a rebuff anymore. He turned around and went upstairs with his companion. Time flew by. Late at night, there were fewer and fewer people in the restaurant. One of the waiters glanced at the black-clothed young man and hesitated for a moment. Then he walked up to him and said with a smile, "Young master, you've been drinking for several days. Why don't I arrange a room for you to rest for a while?" The black-robed young man glanced at the waiter and pondered for a moment. Finally, he put down his wine cup and was about to nod. But at this moment, a white-haired old woman walked into the Purple Cloud House. She stood at the entrance and scanned the hall. The black-clothed youth immediately looked at the white-haired old woman. If one looked carefully, they would discover that there was a strange light in the depths of his dark eyes. Very soon, a brilliant smile crawled onto his face. Then he looked to the shop assistant and said, "No need, I will leave in a bit." "Leave." The waiter was stunned for a moment before he nodded and said, "Then take your time. I'll get to work." After saying that, the waiter turned around and saw the white-haired old woman. He immediately went up to her and asked with a smile, "Old lady, do you want to stay here?" Before the white-haired old woman could speak, the black-clothed youth said first, "He's my guest." The waiter was slightly stunned. Then, a trace of understanding crept into his eyes. It turned out that this person was waiting for someone. At the same time, the white-haired old woman also looked at the black-clothed youth with a glimmer of light in her eyes. "I've been waiting for you for a long time," the black-clothed youth said with a smile. The white-haired old woman walked over and sat opposite the black-clothed youth. The waiter followed and asked, "Old lady, do you need anything?" "No need." The white-haired old woman waved her hand. "Okay, you guys take your time." The waiter nodded, turned around, and ran away. The white-haired old woman sized up the black-clothed youth and said through voice transmission, "The news of Qin Fang's death, was it you who released it?" "Yes." The black-clothed youth nodded. "That's right. This person was Mu Qing, and this white-haired old woman was just an old woman in the eyes of others. However, Mu Qing had already seen through her true face with his all-seeing eye. It was the mysterious lady. When the mysterious lady saw Mu Qing nodded, she frowned and asked, "Who are you?" Mu Qing smiled and said, "The person who almost died in your hands." It turned out to be the young lord of the Mu clan who opened his all-seeing eye. The mysterious lady suddenly realized and said, "You released the news of Qin Feiyang's death on purpose to lure me out, right?" "Yes. I want to see, is Qin Feiyang important in your eyes? And obviously, he still has a certain weight in my heart. Otherwise, you wouldn't have come to me. In the past few days, in order to find me, you should have gone to a lot of places." Mu Qing smiled lightly. The mysterious lady frowned and said, "So, Qin Feiyang's death is just a lie you made up?" Her eyes flashed with a cold light. "No, this is true," Mu Qing said in a deep voice. Hearing this, the mysterious lady's heart trembled, and she secretly said, "What the hell is going on?" 5 days ago, Qin Feiyang and I went to the great Qin Empire but we didn't expect to be discovered by the state preceptor of the great Qin Empire. Now he is imprisoned in the prison of the imperial palace. If we don't rescue him in time, based on his previous actions in the great Qin Empire, he will definitely be doomed. Mu Qing said. Damn it. The mysterious lady clenched her hands and said angrily, Why did you go to the great Qin Empire for no reason? Mu Qing said helplessly, Look at what you're saying. We are not fools. We must have something to do. The mysterious lady frowned and said, Then why did you have to take the risk? She knew Qin Feiyang. He was not a reckless person. For his mother, sigh. It's already happened. It's useless to ask this now. Now, the most important thing is to find a way to rescue him. Mu Qing said. So this is the purpose of you luring me out. But I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. The Mu clan should know the foundation of the great Qin Empire better than I do. With my strength, it's impossible to rescue Qin Feiyang from their hands. The mysterious lady said. Mu Qing said, What if the Mu clan joins in? The mysterious lady was stunned and looked suspiciously at Mu Qing. Hasn't the Mu clan always wanted to get rid of him? Why do you want to rescue him now? I can't help it. But who told him to take the profound sky flame, frost flame, and thunder flame? Mu Qing said bitterly. The mysterious lady sneered. So the Mu clan also wants that miracle. Who wouldn't be tempted by such a place? Do you dare say you don't? Mu Qing said with a smile. The mysterious lady did not deny it. She thought for a moment and nodded. Okay, in order to save that silly boy, I will cooperate with the Mu clan once. But I have a request. You must let that old man go with you. Who? Mu Qing was stunned and asked. Don't play dumb with me. After dawn, we will meet at the Thunder City in the first area. The mysterious lady looked coldly at Mu Qing, got up and opened a portal, and walked in without looking back. Wait, even Yiglao knows who are you? Mu Qing hurriedly got up, stared at the mysterious lady's back, and secretly asked. Her tone was gloomy. However, the mysterious lady did not say a word and quickly disappeared. Bastard! Mu Qing cursed, took out a few hundred gold coins, threw it on the table, and also opened a portal and left. At the same time, the endless sea. The mysterious lady appeared out of thin air above a certain sea. The wind was strong here, and the waves were rolling. The largest wave was even hundreds of feet high, and it could be said to be overwhelming. It was no exaggeration to say that even a battle saint would find it difficult to stand here. However, the mysterious lady stood above the sea like a towering mountain. No matter how strong the wind and waves were, she did not move at all. She took out an illusory form pill, changed back to her original appearance, and looked to the east of the sea. There was an island a few miles away on the sea. It was about a few miles in diameter, and the vegetation was lush. There was actually an island here. This was very illogical, because the strong wind and huge waves from all directions were enough to smash the island into pieces in an instant. But there seemed to be an invisible barrier around the island, blocking the strong wind and huge waves outside. Whoosh! The mysterious lady glanced at the island, then rode the wind and waves and flew to the edge of the island. Then she looked at the center of the island and said loudly, "Old man, an old friend has come to visit. Don't you want to come out and meet her?" In the center of the island stood a giant mountain that was more than 10,000 feet high. From afar, it looked like a giant sword that towered into the clouds. "Old friend." As the mysterious lady's voice fell, a suspicious voice sounded from the top of the mountain. Swish! Immediately after, a brilliant ray of light flew out from the top of the mountain. It was a middle-aged man. He was more than 9 meters tall, and wore a snow-white robe that was spotless. His entire body was emitting an extremely strong aura. He landed in front of the mysterious lady and sized her up suspiciously. His long hair draped over his shoulders, his facial features were regular, and his eyes were very special. It was as if they were condensed from ice, sparkling and translucent, flickering with strands of divine light. "Don't you recognize me?" Seeing that the middle-aged man did not speak for a long time, the mysterious lady laughed. "Who are you?" The middle-aged man frowned. "You really forgot about me." The mysterious lady's expression was a little displeased as she said, "In this forgotten continent, only I know of your existence, and only I know that you live here. Who do you think I am?" "What?" The middle-aged man's eyes widened as he stared at the mysterious lady. His eyes shot out a dazzling light. The mysterious madam smiled and said, "Are you thinking that I'm already dead? Why would I appear in front of you now?" The middle-aged man nodded. "It's a long story. I can only say that I was lucky back then and escaped by luck," the mysterious lady said. The middle-aged man was surprised and bewildered. "Then your face—" "If those people know that I'm still alive, they definitely won't let me off. And I haven't recovered my cultivation back then, so I'm not a match for them. So I can only conceal my identity and change my appearance," the mysterious lady said, and her eyes flickered with ice-cold, killing intent. The middle-aged man asked, "Who wanted to kill you back then?" The mysterious lady pondered for a moment and said, "We'll talk about this later. Right now, I want to ask you for a favor." "Heard about it." A trace of helplessness crawled up the middle-aged man's face as he shook his head and said, "You haven't changed at all. You definitely won't come to me for no reason. Tell me, what do you want me to help you with?" The mysterious lady said, "Accompany me to the Great Qin Empire." "The Great Qin Empire?" The middle-aged man frowned. Suddenly, he seemed to have thought of something and said in shock, "You're talking about the Great Qin Empire that was established by Qin Batian?" "That's right." The mysterious lady nodded. "Why are you going there?" The middle-aged man asked as if he was afraid of the Great Qin Empire. "I'm going to save someone. That person is a descendant of Qin Batian. Due to certain reasons, he's currently imprisoned in the Great Qin Empire's God's prison," the mysterious lady said. The middle-aged man's pupils constricted as he frowned and said, "That's not right. Don't you hate Qin Batian? Why are you going to save his descendant now?" "So much nonsense. Just tell me if you're going to help or not," the mysterious lady said impatiently. "I'm talking nonsense. You have to understand that you're the one asking for my help, not the other way around. Also, it's easy for me to kill you now, so it's best if you don't infuriate me." The middle-aged man was slightly angry, and a bone-piercing cold aura emanated from his body. The mysterious lady raised her brows and said helplessly, "All right, I'll give you time to think about it." The middle-aged man withdrew his killing intent and lowered his head to ponder. A short moment later, he raised his head to look at the mysterious lady and said, "I can help you, but I have a condition." "Speak," the mysterious lady said. The middle-aged man said, "The miracle is about to open, right? This time, I want to enter the miracle." The mysterious lady's eyes flashed as she shook her head and said, "I knew you hadn't given up, but now I don't have the power to stop you. If you want to go, then go." The middle-aged man smiled. Imperial capital. In the past 5 days, the news of Qin Feiyang being imprisoned in the God's prison had also spread. Without a doubt, the entire imperial capital was in an uproar. It could even be said that it was even more sensational than the last time Qin Feiyang killed the princes at the Treasure Pavilion's auction house. And when they received this news, there were naturally people who were happy. For example, Wan Qiu, Zhuge Mingyang, Feng Yan's father, Marquis Qianwu, the current empress, and the mothers of the princes who died at the hands of Qin Feiyang. These were all people who wanted nothing more than to skin Qin Feiyang alive. Of course, they hoped that Qin Feiyang would die a horrible death. Some people were happy, but there were also people who were worried. For example, Ren Wushuang and the others, although they had obtained freedom, but these few days they had not been at ease. They had thought of countless ways but none of them could save Qin Feiyang. In addition to these people, there was also a small number of people who felt sorry for Qin Feiyang's encounter. Sun Dahai was one of them. After spending so much time with Qin Feiyang, he understood Qin Feiyang's character. Although he was not a good person, he would definitely not do anything outrageous. In the end, it was the hatred in his heart that harmed him. If he could give up this hatred, then all of this would not have happened. But then again, could this hatred be let go? Definitely not. Not to mention Qin Feiyang. Anyone who encountered such an encounter would not be able to let go. This was a dead knot that could not be untied. Early the next morning, the calm sky above the Black Dragon Pool suddenly surged. Following closely, the void shattered, the mountains and rivers trembled, and an ancient stone door appeared. Soon, 5 figures walked out of the stone door one after another. The leader was Yiglao, the mysterious madam, and the middle-aged man from the Endless Sea. Next was the Mu family's great ancestor and second ancestor, Mu Qing. Qing, go to the imperial city first and inquire about Qin Feiyang's current situation. When my divine power recovers, we will go to the divine prison. Yiglao glanced at the mountains below, turned to look at Mu Qing, and at the same time put away the space-time gate. Okay. Chapter 9:16. When the portal dissipated, Yiglao looked at the mysterious lady and the middle-aged man and said with a smile, "This should be your first time in the great Qin Empire. Why don't you take a look around?" Whether it was the mysterious lady or the middle-aged man, they were both very mysterious. If the two of them stayed here, he would not be able to recover his divine power in peace. The mysterious lady glanced at Yiglao and looked at the middle-aged man. "Since someone doesn't want to see us, then let's not stay here and look for trouble. Let's go." The middle-aged man nodded. Whoosh! The two of them immediately rushed into the sky, turned into a stream of light, and quickly disappeared into the sky. After Yiglao watched the two of them disappear, his old eyes flashed and landed on a mountain top with the Mu family's great ancestor and second ancestor. "You two protect me and carefully pay attention to the movements around." Yiglao told the two of them and sat cross-legged on the ground. The pores all over his body opened to absorb the essence of heaven and earth and began to recover his divine power. And in the afternoon of the same day, an explosive news suddenly spread like wildfire in the imperial capital. 3 days later, at noon, Qin Feiyang was taken to the central square of the first city and beheaded in public. How could this be? The imperial capital that had not yet calmed down was once again boiling. People were surprised and somewhat in disbelief, because since the establishment of the great Qin Empire, there had never been an emperor's son who was beheaded in public. Qin Feiyang was the first. Of course, beheading in public was not something that had never happened before, but it was usually the kind of unforgivable outlaws. And Qin Feiyang, although he killed the princes in the past, but in the end it was only the emperor's family matter. Was there a need to behead him in public? Not to mention, even if Qin Feiyang was abolished, the royal blood flowing in his body was a fact that could not be erased. The emperor should not be so heartless. However, after many inquiries, they learned that this order was actually given by the emperor himself. People suddenly felt incredible to the extreme. This supreme emperor, how much did he hate Qin Feiyang? In the evening, a young man in black entered the divine prison. This person had a dignified appearance. His body was 7 feet tall and straight, like an iron pine tree. He held a folding fan in his hand and looked very elegant. There was a small sword symbol on his chest, indicating that he was a disciple of the temple. He stood in front of the tower and looked at the empty corridor in silence. A moment later, he took a deep breath and said indifferently, "Qin Feiyang, come out for a chat." After a long while, Qin Feiyang finally appeared. "You still dare to look for me?" He sized up the black-clothed young man with a murderous look in his eyes. This person was none other than Zhuge Mingyang. Zhuge Mingyang waved his folding fan and smiled faintly. Now that you're a prisoner, why wouldn't I dare? Whoosh! Before he finished speaking, Qin Feiyang had already appeared in front of Zhuge Mingyang. The distance between the two was less than half a meter. Qin Feiyang raised a corner of his mouth and said, "Even if I'm a prisoner, I can still kill you." "Is that so? Since you're so confident, why don't you give it a try?" Zhuge Mingyang was as steady as Mount Tai without the slightest fear, but there was a hint of mockery on his face. Qin Feiyang stretched out his arm and grabbed Zhuge Mingyang's head. Boom! Zhuge Mingyang smiled disdainfully. The next moment, a terrifying pressure roared out from his body and rushed toward Qin Feiyang. Qin Feiyang was shocked and quickly retreated. This pressure actually carried a hint of Saint's aura. "Come on." Zhuge Mingyang waved his folding fan slowly and looked at Qin Feiyang contemptuously. Qin Feiyang stabilized his body and looked up and down at Zhuge Mingyang for a moment. He suddenly said, "No wonder you dare to be so fearless. You've already broken through to the Battle Saint realm." Surprised? Zhuge Mingyang asked with a smile. Qin Feiyang shook his head. With Zhuge Mingyang's talent, it was not strange for him to be able to break through to the Battle Saint realm in these few years. But if Zhuge Mingyang thought that he had the right to be arrogant in front of him after breaking through to the Battle Saint realm, then he was gravely mistaken. Qin Feiyang's mind moved, and the double-winged snow eagle appeared, saying, "Kill him." "No problem." The double-winged snow eagle laughed, and a terrifying saint's aura broke out from its body. Saint Beast. The smile on Zhuge Mingyang's face suddenly froze, and a trace of panic appeared in his eyes. Although he had broken through to the Battle Saint realm, he was only a one-star Battle Saint, and the aura emitted by this snow eagle was more than a few times stronger than his. Obviously, its cultivation level was much higher than his. "Kid, going against Qin Feiyang is the worst decision you've ever made in your life." The double-winged snow eagle laughed cruelly and swept towards Zhuge Mingyang like lightning, its eyes emitting a cold light. Zhuge Mingyang retreated in panic. "Qin Feiyang, if you dare to kill Zhuge Mingyang, today will be the day you die." However, at this time, a voice filled with killing intent came from outside. The owner of the voice was the black-robed old man who was guarding outside. Qin Feiyang raised his eyebrows and shouted at the double-winged snow eagle, "Come back!" The double-winged snow eagle also looked at the door angrily and quickly retreated to Qin Feiyang's side. Zhuge Mingyang finally let out a sigh of relief, but his whole body was already drenched in cold sweat. Qin Feiyang looked at him indifferently and said, "I thought you were very powerful, but it turns out that you're just SOSO." The sarcasm in his words was undisguised. Zhuge Mingyang was a bit angry, but suddenly he seemed to think of something, and a bright smile appeared on his face. He smiled and said, "Do you know why I'm here today?" Qin Feiyang was silent. "I am here to tell you that today His Majesty has ordered that 3 days later at noon, in the central square of the first district, you will be beheaded in public. In other words, you only have 3 days left." Zhuge Mingyang pursed his lips and smiled. Boom! Hearing this, Qin Feiyang was like a bolt from the blue, and his body and mind trembled. He was actually going to be beheaded in public. Being beheaded in public by your own father. You must be very sad, right? Zhuge Mingyang joked. This sentence, no doubt, sprinkled a handful of salt on Qin Feiyang's wound. Qin Feiyang painfully closed his eyes, his hands tightly clenched together. Because he used too much strength, his nails had already pierced the flesh of his palms. Drip! Fresh blood dripped down drop by drop onto the ground, splashing into the air. Although my talent is not as good as yours, I'm better than you in one thing. I have a father who loves me. No matter what I want, he will do everything possible to give it to me. Since I was young, he has never scolded me, let alone ordered me to be killed. To be honest, sometimes I really sympathize with you. Back then, when you were born, you were the pride of the imperial capital and were doted on by everyone. You even took away my title as the #1 demon. At that time, although you were still young, you were already the idol of countless people. But now you've fallen to this point like a rat on the street, hated by everyone, Zhuge Mingyang said with a smile, and there was a strong sense of satisfaction in his words. So now you're here to laugh at me? Qin Feiyang finally opened his eyes, and the pain between his eyebrows had disappeared, replaced by calmness. Zhuge Mingyang was surprised. How could he calm down so quickly? Qin Feiyang said again, "Did you think that after hearing what you said, I would roar in anger and unwillingness?" Zhuge Mingyang did not answer, but his expression proved everything. Qin Feiyang said indifferently, "If that's the case, then I'm afraid you'll be disappointed, because I've already seen through all of this." "Seen through?" Zhuge Mingyang sneered. "Whether you've really seen through it or not, you know best in your heart." Qin Feiyang smiled and said, "Don't always talk about me, let's talk about you. Don't you think that you're very pitiful?" Zhuge Mingyang smiled. "I have a perfect family and I have extraordinary talent. What's there to be pitiful about?" "Really? Then tell me, why did you work so hard for the first prince?" Qin Feiyang teased. Zhuge Mingyang raised his eyebrows. "I'll tell you why. It's all because of power and status. No matter how good your talent is, no matter how strong you are, in the face of the supreme imperial power, you have to humbly bow your head. To put it in simpler terms, no matter how you jump around, you can't escape the fate of being a slave for the rest of your life." Qin Feiyang smiled. Zhuge Mingyang's eyes darkened, as if Qin Feiyang had really poked his sore spot. A slave has to have the consciousness of a slave. Although I'm no longer a prince now, I'm born to be a level higher than you. Do you know why? The reason is that the bloodline of the first emperor flows in my body, and this is something you can never compare to. Qin Feiyang laughed. He knew that Zhuge Mingyang was a very prideful person, and he would definitely go crazy after hearing these words. As expected, Zhuge Mingyang's face became gloomier, and his eyes were filled with a strong murderous intent. Seeing this, the double-winged snow eagle laughed and did not hide the gloating in his eyes. He joked, "What else do you want to say? We're all ears." Zhuge Mingyang glanced at the man and the eagle, and suddenly laughed. "Laugh all you want. Anyway, you don't have much time left. Besides, after you die, I'll take good care of your friends." Then he added, with a cold smile in his eyes, and the word "take good care of" was especially emphasized. Then he turned around and left. Qin Feiyang narrowed his eyes and said, "If you dare to touch a hair of my friends, I'll let the whole Zhuge family die with them. Also, I may not die. Then we'll wait and see." Zhuge Mingyang smiled without looking back and left the god's prison. He may not die. What a childish thing to say. No one who was ordered to be killed by the emperor could survive. Looking at the stone door slowly closing, Qin Feiyang's eyes flashed coldly, and he went to the castle with the double-winged snow eagle. In the castle, Lu Hong and the others looked at him worriedly. Qin Feiyang said with a faint smile, "Don't worry, such a small thing can't hurt me." Everyone looked at each other, and the worry in their hearts grew stronger. If it was someone else, they might believe it, but they knew Qin Feiyang too well. Don't be fooled by Qin Feiyang's indifferent attitude right now. He was definitely very sad in his heart. Chapter 9:17. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. It was still dark. The people from the various districts swarmed towards the first district, including the disciples of the Divine Hall. Even the cities outside the imperial city had countless people rushing over to watch the show. There was a long queue at the fixed teleportation gates that led to the first district. "Brother, I have something urgent to do in the first district. Can I cut the queue?" "Something urgent? Look at everyone. Who doesn't have something urgent? Go to the back of the line. Don't cause public anger." Although it was still early, everyone wanted to get to the first district as soon as possible. Of course, there were also some smart people who had entered the first district as early as yesterday or the day before. As for the first district, it was no surprise that all the streets were packed. The central square was located in the center of the first district. It was thousands of feet wide. The ground was covered with hard blue stones. Traces of weathering could be seen everywhere. Early in the morning, a group of invincible Black Army soldiers arrived at the square. There were more than 100 of them. Each of them emitted a holy aura. They stood at the edge of the square with sky halberds in their hands. They stopped anyone who wanted to enter the square. They were full of murderous intent. The square was surrounded by a sea of people. There were several luxurious restaurants near the square. The status of these restaurants in the imperial capital was not as high as the Fragrant Moon brothel, and their business was not as good as the Fragrant Moon brothels. However, since the news that Qin Feiyang was going to be beheaded in the central square spread, a large number of people rushed here. Because these restaurants were very close to the central square, standing on the top few floors, they could clearly see the situation in the central square. So last night, these restaurants were full. At this moment, in these restaurants, all the rooms near the central square had their windows wide open. In front of the windows, there were many people. There were men and women, old and young. These people were all influential figures, including the various dukes. In the west, there was a restaurant called the Moon Inn. In a private room on the top floor, more than a dozen young men and women gathered together. They had outstanding looks and extraordinary temperaments. The aura they exuded was also very strong. There was a small sword symbol on the chest of their clothes. One of the young men in black said with a smile, "It's the first time in 100 years that the imperial city is so lively." "Yes, it's all thanks to Qin Feiyang." A woman in white immediately said with a smile. Creak! At this moment, the door was pushed open. A young man in black walked into the private room. It was Zhuge Mingyang. "Brother Zhuge." The group of young men and women in the private room saw Zhuge Mingyang's arrival. Zhuge Mingyang waved his fan and said with a smile, "Everyone has come early. The son of an emperor has been beheaded. Such a good show. Of course we have to come early to watch." Someone laughed. Zhuge Mingyang smiled and walked to the window. Looking at the central square, he muttered to himself, "Didn't you tell me that you wouldn't die for sure? Why hasn't there been any movement yet?" Zhuge Mingyang turned to look at the man and nodded with a smile. "Did you tell Qin Feiyang that he would be beheaded today?" Immediately, the group of people looked at him curiously. "Of course." Zhuge Mingyang nodded with a smile. "How did he react? Was he very sad, very desperate, very painful?" The crowd asked anxiously. Zhuge Mingyang shook his head and sighed. "On the contrary, he was not sad, but humiliated me." "Ah." The group of people looked at each other. At the same time, in the private room of a restaurant in the north, a group of people gathered. But they were different from Zhuge Mingyang and the others. Their faces were full of anxiety and worry. The leaders were the Old Master and Zhu Yu. Ren Wushuang, Tan Wu, Shen Mei, and Lu Xingxin were also there. In the south, in front of the window of a private room, a white-haired old man was also standing. He had his hands behind his back, and his temperament was outstanding. He was dressed in white, without a speck of dust, but he was wearing a mask on his face, so his face couldn't be seen clearly. He looked mysterious. At the same time, in a restaurant in the east, 6 figures stood side by side, looking at the central square among the sea of people in silence. It was Mu Qing and the others. After a while, the mysterious lady withdrew her gaze and looked at Mu Qing. She asked, did Qin Feiyang send you any messages these days? No. Maybe he doesn't know that we have sneaked into the capital. It's also possible that the prison of God can cut off the connection with the image crystal. Mu Qing said. The great ancestor of the Mu clan sneered. Isn't that good? When he is desperate, we will appear again and give him a surprise. I'm afraid that not only Qin Feiyang but also the emperor and the state preceptor will be full of surprises. The second ancestor of the Mu clan followed, his eyes flashing. That's not important. Mu Qing shook her head and looked at the mysterious lady. She smiled faintly. I'm just looking forward to Qin Feiyang's expression when he sees that we joined hands with you to save him. Boring, the mysterious lady said expressionlessly and continued to look at the central square. At the same time, in the depths of the imperial palace, there was a magnificent palace. Above the entrance of the palace hung a golden plaque. 3 bold and vigorous words were written on it, as if they were carved with iron hooks and silver, releasing a shocking aura. Bright Heaven Palace. Around the palace, there were Kirin army, holding halberds, standing straight like iron pine. At the gate, there were 2 maids and 2 eunuchs standing respectfully. In front of the palace, there was a garden. In the garden, the grass and trees were green. Hundreds of flowers were blooming. There were small bridges, flowing water, rockery, and pavilions. And every intersection in the garden was also guarded by the Kirin army. At this moment, on a grassland, the emperor was playing with a child. This child was only about 2 years old. He had just learned to walk not long ago and was staggering. The child and the emperor were chasing back and forth on the grassland. Joyful laughter filled every corner of the garden. At the side, there was a woman in palace attire. She was draped in phoenix clouds and had a phoenix crown on her head. The phoenix robe on her body was full of noble aura. In this imperial palace, the only person who could dress like this was the empress. And this woman was the first prince's mother. That child was the dragon son that she and the emperor had given birth to in the past 2 years. Looking at the happy father and son, the woman's face was full of smiles. At the same time, on a small path outside the garden, a white-clothed woman was running towards them. Empress, your injuries have just healed. Run slower. There were 2 maids behind her. They chased after the woman in white and shouted anxiously. However, the woman in white did not seem to hear them. Her footsteps became faster and faster. Her slightly pale face was full of anxiety. She was Qin Feiyang's mother. These few days passed. With the help of the fire of life, her injuries had healed, and she had fused with the fire of life. Now, like Qin Feiyang and Fatso, she had an immortal body. And now she came to Bright Heaven Palace to find the emperor to plead for Qin Feiyang. In fact, this was not the first time she came. These days, she came several times a day, but every time she was stopped outside by the Kirin army. But this time, she had great determination. She would not give up until she saw the emperor, because Qin Feiyang was going to be beheaded today. If she did not see the emperor, there would be no turning back. Again, at the entrance of the garden, there were 2 Kirin army guards. Seeing the woman in white from afar, they could not help but frown. Soon, the woman in white came to the entrance of the garden. She glanced at the 2 Kirin army and wanted to barge in. Empress, you can't. The 2 Kirin army quickly reached out to stop the woman in white. I must see him today. The woman in white said, I really can't. His Majesty said that I have to accompany the little prince for the whole day and will not see anyone. Empress, please don't make things difficult for us, okay? The 2 Kirin army said with a difficult expression. Although the woman in white was not in a good situation now, she was after all the empress. So these Kirin army did not dare to be too presumptuous. Empress, let's go back. His Majesty knows why you are here, so he will not see you. The 2 maids caught up and stood in front of the woman in white, persuading her in a low voice. "I won't go." The woman in white shook her head. In the garden, the emperor and the empress also noticed the woman in white. However, the emperor just casually glanced at her and then retracted his gaze and continued to play with the little prince. And the empress' mouth was pursed with a hint of mockery. At the same time, looking at the emperor and the little prince laughing and talking, the woman in white could not help but feel a strong anger rising in her heart. "Your Majesty, he is your child. Fei Yong is also your child. You can't be so biased," the woman in white cried. The emperor was still indifferent. The empress glanced at the emperor, then looked at the woman in white and said with a smile, "Sister, you are wrong. When Qin Fei Yong was expelled from the imperial palace, he no longer had anything to do with our imperial family. Now he is just an outsider." "Shut up." The woman in white suddenly looked at her with a cold light in her eyes. The empress' pupil shrank and she looked a little scared. In the past, when Qin Fei Yong's mother was the empress, she was just a concubine. When she saw Qin Fei Yong's mother, she had to bow. When Qin Fei Yong's mother was on the throne, she was a person who acted swiftly and decisively. In addition, she was very strong and had the powerful Liu family behind her. Therefore, all the concubines in the imperial palace were very afraid of her, including the empress now. Although their identities were changed now, it was difficult to get rid of the shadow accumulated in the past. However, hearing the woman in white scolding the emperor frowned and looked up at the woman in white. He said, "The one who should shut up is you. Don't pester endlessly and wear down my patience." The woman in white trembled and tears of grievance flowed from her eyes. The empress waved her hand impatiently and said, "Go away. Don't hinder us here." With the emperor backing her, she naturally would not be afraid and put on an overbearing attitude. The woman in white glanced at her and then looked at the emperor. She knelt on the ground and said with grief and indignation, "You have killed Fei Yong twice. You can't be so heartless. This is unfair to Fei Yong. If you don't take back your order today, I will kneel here and never get up. Then you can kneel there." Chapter 918. The woman in white did not get up. After fusing with the flame of life, her slightly aged face exuded vitality once more. Her skin was crystal clear, and her hair was like a waterfall. However, at this moment, her face was full of helplessness. The 2 Kirin army soldiers and 2 maids were trying to persuade her, but she did not seem to hear them. Her eyes were full of determination. Time passed by breath. At this moment, whether it was Rin Wushuang's group, Zhuge Mingyang's group, or other unrelated people, they all felt that time was passing very slowly. It had only been a single morning, but it felt as long as a few decades. Finally, noon was coming. It was early summer, and the weather was not too hot. However, many people were already sweating. Everyone looked at the central square and gradually quieted down. Their hands were clenched tightly together. A tense atmosphere pervaded the air. In fact, many people did not know what they were nervous about. This was about Qin Fei Yong's execution. What did it have to do with them? Why were they nervous? However, they still felt that they were out of breath. It was very oppressive. Whoosh! Suddenly, a white-haired old man descended on the square. Next to him was a middle-aged man in golden armor. The moment the imperial tutor appeared, there was a vast and mighty pressure that surged out in all directions. "Greetings, Grand Master!" Under the pressure, the people gathered around the square, including the invincible Black Army, were all afraid and knelt down to worship him. "Yes." The Grand Master nodded and then looked at the man in golden armor next to him. The man in golden armor quickly took out a wooden armchair from his cosmos bag and placed it on the ground. The Grand Master waved his sleeves and turned around to sit on the wooden armchair. The man in golden armor took out a tea table, a teapot, and teacups. After placing them one by one, he began to make tea for the Grand Master. The man in golden armor was none other than the commander of the invincible Black Army. This old bastard really knows how to enjoy life. In a restaurant in the south, a dark-skinned young man in linen clothes stood in front of the window. He looked at the Grand Master, who was sitting on the wooden armchair with a cold look in his eyes. It was Lu Zheng. Whoosh! Suddenly, two more people suddenly appeared in the room. Lu Zheng sensed their auras and turned to look at them. He said unhappily, "Uncle He, second grandpa, why are you only here now? Isn't it supposed to be executed at noon? What's the hurry?" The burly man rolled his eyes, walked to the window, and asked, "What's the situation now?" "Little cousin hasn't appeared yet." But Lu Zheng frowned when he said this. "But what?" The burly man and the sackcloth old man looked at him suspiciously. "Yesterday I had nothing to do, so I went to the nearby restaurants and found a lot of unfathomable auras. I'm wondering if this aura has anything to do with my little cousin." Lu Zheng frowned. Unfathomable. The burly Dao and the linen old man looked at each other, their eyes filled with bewilderment. "It's hard to explain. Take a look for yourselves." Lu Zheng took out a gray stone. This stone was simple and unadorned. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary pebble. However, there were extremely complicated lines on it. Those lines were like the meridians of a human. Lu Zheng grabbed the gray stone and slowly injected a wisp of battle chi into it. Immediately, an invisible ripple overflowed from the gray stone and spread out in all directions. This wave was colorless, odorless, and had no aura at all. No one noticed it. Suddenly, the gray stone trembled slightly. Immediately after, the lines on the stone glowed with a faint golden light. "What? This is the light of gods!" The linen old man and the burly man looked at the golden light and trembled. The burly man shook his head and said, "No, this should be the light of gods of the state preceptor." But before he finished speaking, the gray stone in Lu Zheng's hand trembled again. "There's actually more than one god." The burly man's pupils contracted, his eyes filled with disbelief. Buzz! However, it was not over yet. The gray stone trembled a few more times. "For gods!" The burly man's eyes widened in anger. How was this possible? He looked at Lu Zheng and said, "Is there something wrong with the heavens, I jade?" The corner of Lu Zheng's mouth twitched fiercely. He rolled his eyes at the burly man and put away the gray stone. The linen old man glanced at the crowd outside the window and shook his head. "There's nothing wrong with the heavens, I jade." "Then, apart from the state preceptor, who are the other 3 gods? Does our great Qin Empire have so many gods?" The burly man was surprised. "They're not gods either. From the analysis of the light emitted by the heavens, I jade, they should be fake gods like the state preceptor. However, the identity of these people is indeed confusing." The linen old man frowned. Lu Zheng said, "Second grandpa, these are all small questions. The key is, why are they here?" The linen old man pondered for a while and said, "I think it should be related to Feiyong. Otherwise, why are they here?" Lu Zheng was taken aback and asked, "So, we don't have to do anything today?" "I guess so." The linen old man nodded, but he was not sure. Lu Zheng looked at the linen old man and sighed. "If that's the case, then we don't have to disturb the big boss." "Yes." "The old man can't withstand such a storm now." The burly man also nodded in agreement. On his rough face, there was a trace of worry that could not be dispelled. "They're here." At this moment, the linen old man suddenly looked at the sky above the square. His old eyes flashed. Lu Zheng and the burly man immediately calmed down and looked in the direction of the linen old man's gaze. At the same time, the people in the nearby restaurants and the people around the square all looked up at the void above the square. The state preceptor also looked up, but he immediately withdrew his gaze. He picked up the tea that the invincible Black Army commander had brewed for him and tasted it. Whoosh! Under the gaze of thousands of people, two figures appeared in the sky above the square. One of them was the commander of the Kirin army. The other was naturally Qin Feiyang. However, at this moment, Qin Feiyang's hands and feet were tied with a black iron chain. The iron chain was as thick as a baby's arm. It shone with a black light and emitted an obscure aura. It was an iron chain made of divine gravity iron, which could imprison people's battle chi and strength. The commander of the Kirin army landed in the center of the square with Qin Feiyang. Although he had been locked in the prison of God for several days, he had been resting in the castle. Therefore, his mental appearance was the same as usual. The only difference was that his eyes were colder than before. He stood in the center of the square and looked around at the crowd. He shook his head and said, "So many people have come to watch. You really think highly of me, Qin Feiyang." The state preceptor chuckled as he sipped his tea. "That's right. You're the first person to have shocked the entire imperial capital during the execution. Don't you feel proud?" Qin Feiyang turned around and looked at the state preceptor. He looked very calm. "Are you afraid?" The state preceptor looked up at him and asked. Qin Feiyang smiled and walked toward the state preceptor. As he walked, the iron chain on his feet made clanking sounds. "You can still be so calm when you're about to die. This courage alone is enough to make people respect you." In the pavilion where Zhuge Mingyang was, a young man in white looked at Qin Feiyang with a trace of admiration in his eyes. "Humph, this is not calmness. This is stubbornness." Zhuge Mingyang snorted with a strong sense of hatred in his eyes. "Brother Zhuge, aren't you always calm no matter what you encounter? Why do you look a little anxious now?" The young man in white was stunned and looked at Zhuge Mingyang in confusion. Hearing this, the others also looked at Zhuge Mingyang suspiciously. Indeed, it was as the white-clothed youth had said. When facing Qin Feiyang, Zhuge Mingyang had become somewhat different from before. To put it nicely, he didn't have his usual demeanor. To put it bluntly, Zhuge Mingyang's current behavior was a little despicable. Was it because of the crown prince? But that didn't make sense. Zhuge Mingyang used to work for the crown prince, but that was all. Even if the crown prince was killed by Qin Feiyang, Zhuge Mingyang wouldn't lose anything. Was it necessary for him to hate Qin Feiyang so much? Or could it be that the relationship between Zhuge Mingyang and the crown prince wasn't as simple as it seemed on the surface? But regarding this, Zhuge Mingyang didn't give any explanation. In the plaza, Qin Feiyang walked over to the imperial tutor's side and looked at the Iron Black Corps' commander, who was standing there motionlessly as he calmly said, "You haven't forgotten about how you ambushed me in the Forgotten Continent, right?" The Invincible Black Army's general's eyes slightly trembled. Although Qin Feiyang was now a prisoner, and although he was stronger than Qin Feiyang, when he looked at Qin Feiyang's eyes, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fear. "Looks like you haven't forgotten." Qin Feiyang chuckled and looked down at the state preceptor. He said with a smile, "I haven't eaten or drunk for a few days. My mouth is a little dry." "Impudent! Do you know what kind of situation you're in right now?" The Invincible Black Army's general shouted. The state preceptor raised his head and looked at the Invincible Black Army's general. He said unhappily, "Is it your turn to speak?" "I'm sorry." The Invincible Black Army's general quickly lowered his head. "If you want to flatter someone, you have to look at the right time. You can't do it at any time." Qin Feiyang looked at him mockingly. "You're right." The state preceptor nodded and smiled. He didn't give the Invincible Black Army's general any face. When the Invincible Black Army's general failed to sneak attack on Qin Feiyang, he was very angry. He raised his head and looked at the sky. There was still a little time before noon. Then he glanced at the Invincible Black Army's general and said, "Why aren't you pouring tea for His Highness?" "Yes." The Invincible Black Army's general quickly took out an armchair from his Cosmos bag and placed it next to Qin Feiyang. Then, he quickly took out a teacup and poured tea for Qin Feiyang, respectfully. Qin Feiyang sat down on the wooden armchair, picked up the teacup and took a sip from it. The tea tasted good and left a nice fragrance in his mouth. The state preceptor smiled and asked, "How is it?" "Not bad." Qin Feiyang nodded. Haha. Chapter 919. Qin Feiyang nodded and said with a smile, "Yes, life is more important than anything else." The state preceptor asked with a smile, "Then tell this old man frankly, have you ever regretted what you did?" "What things? Killing the princes? Or challenging the emperor? Or going against you?" Qin Feiyang asked back. The state preceptor smiled faintly and said, "Do you still need this old man to explain? You should be well aware of it." Qin Feiyang sighed softly and said, "I'm not good at guessing riddles." The state preceptor shook his head and laughed. The two were like old friends, sitting in the square, drinking tea and chatting, without any sense of nervousness. In the private room, the linen-clothed old man looked at Qin Feiyang from afar, his old face full of admiration, and suddenly said, "Zheng?" "What?" Lu Zheng turned his head and looked at the linen-clothed old man suspiciously. The linen-clothed old man asked, "If it were you in such a desperate situation, would you still be so calm?" Lu Zheng fell silent. In all honesty, he couldn't do it. Not to mention him, perhaps no one could be as calm as Qin Feiyang in the face of the imminent beheading crisis. He had to admit that he had underestimated this little cousin of his all this time. In the square, the state preceptor looked up at the sun again, put down the teacup and looked at Qin Feiyang and said with a faint smile, "It's almost time. If you have any last words, quickly say them." Qin Feiyang said, "No last words, but I have a wish." "What wish?" the state preceptor asked. Qin Feiyang said, "Can you tear off your disguise and let me see your original appearance?" The state preceptor raised his eyebrows without a trace. Qin Feiyang raised a corner of his mouth and said jokingly, "It must be very tiring to pretend to be a good old man in front of the world all day long." The state preceptor chuckled, but his smile had become a little stiff. Qin Feiyang said with a smile, "It seems that my words have made you very unhappy." Why should this old man care about the words of a dying man? The state preceptor smiled indifferently. "Die. To me, death is not scary. The scariest thing is that I won't be able to see the person I miss the most before I die." Qin Feiyang slowly got up and looked in the direction of the imperial palace. A hint of mockery flashed across the imperial tutor's eyes as he thought to himself, "Don't look forward to it. Your mother won't come." Qin Feiyang frowned. The imperial preceptor sent a voice transmission. "You still don't know, right? In order to plead for you, your mother has been kneeling in Bright Sky Palace for an entire morning." "What?" Qin Feiyang trembled both physically and mentally. In the depths of his calm heart, a monstrous rage suddenly surged. Bright Heaven Palace was no longer the Bright Heaven Palace of the past. It was now the residence of the current Celestial Empress and the little prince. For him, his mother had actually knelt in Bright Heaven Palace. He could imagine how much humiliation his mother had suffered. He couldn't stand it. "Are you very angry? But unfortunately, you can't do anything now. But don't worry, after you die and I get Chang Shui and the castle, I won't make things difficult for her. At most, I'll just cripple her cultivation." The imperial preceptor secretly sent a voice transmission. After that, he no longer paid attention to Qin Feiyang. He picked up the teacup and tasted it with a smile. Qin Feiyang suddenly lowered his head and stared at the imperial preceptor. His eyes flashed with shocking killing intent. "The time has come. At this time, the commander of the invincible Black Army said indifferently. Qin Feiyang closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened his eyes again, his eyes were dead silent. "Let's go." The commander of the invincible Black Army stepped forward and grabbed Qin Feiyang's shoulder from behind. "Get your dirty hands off me. I can walk by myself," Qin Feiyang said coldly. He slapped the commander's arm away and strode toward the center of the square. The commander of the invincible Black Army sneered and turned to look at the imperial preceptor. "My lord, this subordinate will personally behead Qin Feiyang." "Okay." The imperial preceptor nodded. The commander of the invincible Black Army's eyes flashed with killing intent. He quickly caught up with Qin Feiyang and said to himself, "I didn't want to target you, but I have no choice." Qin Feiyang said expressionlessly, "Just say what you want to say. Don't beat around the bush. I know you too well. If you don't die, I'll definitely die in your hands. Because I almost killed you in the past. So I can only feel at ease if I personally behead you." The commander of the invincible Black Army said. "You're quite aware of it." Qin Feiyang was surprised. "How can you survive in the imperial palace if you're not aware of it?" The commander of the invincible Black Army sneered. The Kirin Army's commander had been standing in the center of the square. Seeing Qin Feiyang and the commander of the invincible Black Army, he slightly frowned but didn't say anything. "Kneel." When Qin Feiyang walked to the center of the square, the commander of the invincible Black Army shouted with a cold face, "Kneel? In this world, except for my mother, no one is qualified to make me kneel." Qin Feiyang said proudly. "Stubborn." The commander of the invincible Black Army was furious. He reached out his hand and grabbed the back of Qin Feiyang's head, pushing Qin Feiyang down to the ground. However, Qin Feiyang was like an iron pine, standing proudly on the ground. His legs didn't bend at all. Seeing this, the Kirin Army's commander couldn't bear it. He turned his head and looked at the State Master, but found that the State Master pretended not to see it. "Kneel." The commander of the invincible Black Army was even angrier. He kicked Qin Feiyang's calf. Qin Feiyang immediately bent his legs and kneeled on the ground. The commander of the invincible Black Army showed a trace of disdain. "How dare you be so arrogant in front of me? Do you really think you're still the 14th prince?" However, when Qin Feiyang's knees were about to touch the ground, Qin Feiyang stood up abruptly. "What?" The commander of the invincible Black Army was stunned. Then he became angry and kicked Qin Feiyang's legs again. "Stop!" The Kirin Army's commander couldn't stand it anymore. He stepped beside Qin Feiyang and pushed the commander of the invincible Black Army away with his palm. "What are you doing?" The commander of the invincible Black Army kept stepping back. After he stabilized his body, he stared at the Kirin Army in shock and anger. Although Qin Feiyang has been removed from his position as a prince, he still has the blood of His Majesty in his body. Don't you think you're being too careless? The Kirin Army's commander said with a sullen face. The commander of the invincible Black Army raised his eyebrows and said in a deep voice, "His Majesty has said that he is no longer a member of the royal family. Now you're trying to stop me. Are you trying to give him a chance to escape? How dare you? Who gave you the guts to speak to this commander like this?" The Kirin Army's commander was furious. Although they were both commanders, the commander of the Kirin Army had a higher position in the imperial palace than the commander of the invincible Black Army. If it was before, he would have slapped the commander of the invincible Black Army. But it was different now. Now that the commander of the invincible Black Army was with the state preceptor, he had to consider the state preceptor's face. Even so, the commander of the invincible Black Army was a bit scared when he saw the Kirin Army's commander was angry. The Kirin Army's commander is right. Qin Feiyang has the blood of the emperor in his body. Let's leave him some dignity. The state preceptor glanced at the Kirin Army's commander and said, "Yes." The commander of the invincible Black Army bowed and replied. Then he looked at the Kirin Army's commander and said coldly, "Are you satisfied now? Can you step aside?" The Kirin army's commander raised his eyebrows and walked away. However, he secretly sent a voice transmission to Qin Feiyang. Why don't you escape now? Now that they had left the prison of God, Qin Feiyang could hide in the castle and slowly find a chance to escape. But now, Qin Feiyang didn't seem to have such a plan. If I escape now, they will use my mother to threaten me again. I don't want to put my mother in danger again. Qin Feiyang said to himself. Alas, if Her Majesty could hear this, I believe she would be very happy. Don't worry, I will take good care of your friends in the future. I will also persuade His Majesty to treat Her Majesty better. The Kirin army's commander sighed deeply and sent a voice transmission. Thank you. Qin Feiyang thanked him secretly. Then he glanced at the crowd in the square and slowly closed his eyes. At this moment, he didn't fear death at all. He was very calm and ordinary. He even felt relieved from the bottom of his heart. Since he was 10 years old, he had been struggling to survive. He didn't have the happiness and laughter that other children had. He only had Uncle Yuanbo by his side. But in the end, Uncle Yuanbo also left him, and he became a person. He had been really tired all these years. He hated everyone and even God. Why was it so unfair to him? He tried hard to change everything and take back everything that he had lost. But in the face of the supreme imperial power, he felt deeply powerless. Maybe in some people's eyes, he was a sign of incompetence. But after so many years, he really couldn't hold on any longer. He wasn't a perfect person, and there was no perfect person in the world. He also had a weak side. If it were anyone else, they would have probably collapsed a long time ago after encountering the setbacks and bumps in Qin Feiyang's life. It wasn't easy for him to hold on until now and only admit defeat. Clang! Suddenly, along with a deafening metallic sound, a golden halberd appeared in front of the commander of the invincible Black Army. The halberd was 6 feet long and looked like it was made of gold. The blade of the halberd emitted a piercing light. At this moment, the square fell into a dead silence. Everyone held their breath and looked at the commander of the invincible Black Army. The commander of the invincible Black Army stood behind Qin Feiyang and reached out his hand to grab the halberd. Then he slowly raised it. Grandpa, Feiyang can't die. Can you think of a way to save him? Ren Wuxuang looked at this scene, and tears came out of his eyes. Shuang, this is the Emperor's order. You can't go against it. The old master sighed. Sigh. Dong Xingyang and the others also sighed. As the saying goes, even a vicious tiger won't eat its cubs. However, this current emperor was actually ruthless enough to kill his own son. How heartless! It was no wonder that Qin Feiyang hated his father so much. However, there was one person who didn't look worried at all. There was even a faint smile on his face. This person was Lu Xingqian. Brother Qin, isn't it too early to be free now? My plan can't be carried out without you, he muttered to himself and raised his head to look at a restaurant in the east. Mu Qing and the others were standing in front of the window, staring at the central square. Mu Qing also raised her head and looked at Lu Xingqian as if she had sensed his gaze. Chapter 920. Mu Qing showed a relieved smile. At the same time, the atmosphere in the central square had reached an unprecedented tense point. Everyone held their breath and looked at the halberd that was raised high. Under the sunlight, the blade emitted a dazzling light. Finally, noon arrived. Kill! The imperial master lowered his head and uttered a cold word. He was still sitting in the armchair, holding the teacup like a king. He didn't look at Qin Feiyang at all. Cold and ruthless, it was vividly displayed by him. As soon as the imperial master spoke, the commander of the invincible Black Army was filled with killing intent. Clang! The halberd that was raised high suddenly trembled and emitted a deafening metallic sound. It was aimed at Qin Feiyang's neck. In the end, no one can save you. Looking at this scene, Zhuge Mingying sneered and walked out of the pavilion. Because, in his opinion, Qin Feiyang was going to die. There was no need to continue watching. It was not only Zhuge Mingying. Everyone on scene also thought that way. Qin Feiyang wouldn't have a chance to live when the blade was about to fall. However, everything was out of everyone's expectation. The halberd was about to fall on Qin Feiyang's neck. Everyone could already foresee the tragic scene of Qin Feiyang's head being separated from his body. Boom! But at this moment, a terrifying pressure erupted like a volcano, instantly enveloping the entire central square. Everything was still. The commander of the invincible Black Army stopped moving. The halberd stopped an inch away from Qin Feiyang's neck. At this moment, time seemed to have stopped. Everyone in the central square was still in the same position as before, but the people in the nearby restaurants weren't restrained. What's going on? Zhuge Mingyang, who had just turned around, was shocked and confused. He immediately looked at the central square. This pressure! When he saw the situation in the square, his heart was in turmoil. Even the commander of the invincible Black Army was restrained. Who was it? He scanned his surroundings, looking for the owner of the pressure. In the meantime, all the people in the restaurants near the square were also looking for the owner of the pressure, including Ran Wushuang and the others. In the end, everyone's gaze was locked onto an old man. It's him, Yiglao. The faces of Ren Wushuang and the others were instantly filled with ecstasy. Back in the divine prison, they had seen Yiglao and knew how powerful Yiglao was. Although he might not be able to save Qin Feiyang, as long as he was here, Qin Feiyang would definitely not die. However, the others didn't know Yiglao's identity, let alone his strength. At this moment, his face was filled with shock and confusion. They were shocked because of Yiglao's strength and courage. One had to know. Now the state preceptor was personally overseeing the situation. However, this old man dared to openly release his pressure to prevent the commander of the invincible Black Army from killing Qin Feiyang. This was a blatant provocation. What made them confused was, who was this old man? What did he have to do with Qin Feiyang? Why hadn't they seen or even heard of him before? In the central square, everyone was restrained by Yiglao's pressure, except for Qin Feiyang and the state preceptor. The state preceptor was also a false god, so Yiglao's pressure couldn't restrain him. As for Qin Feiyang, it wasn't that he could ignore Yiglao's pressure, but that Yiglao deliberately didn't restrain him. Alas! A long sigh broke the atmosphere here. Qin Feiyang slowly opened his eyes and raised his head to look at old Yi and the others. His eyes were filled with complicated emotions. Bastard! Why are you looking at me like that? Seeing this, the anger in Mu Qing's heart suddenly flared up. They came all the way here to save this bastard, but he didn't show any gratitude. Instead, he seemed to blame them for being nosy. Qin Feiyang glanced at Mu Qing indifferently. Without saying a word, he turned around and looked at the commander of the invincible Black Army. Although the commander of the invincible Black Army was restrained, his mind was still working. At this moment, he was panicking, because Qin Feiyang could move. If Qin Feiyang wanted to kill him now, it would be as easy as stepping on an ant. However, Qin Feiyang didn't kill him. He just glanced at him and then looked away to the halberd above him. The halberd was shining with cold light. It was very sharp. Qin Feiyang reached out his hand and took the halberd from the commander of the invincible Black Army. Then he rubbed the sharp blade. To be honest, I really want to die and be done with it. It's too tiring. You people who have always lived in the imperial capital and lived like princes will never understand how I survived all these years. So I want to be free. But some people don't want me to die. Maybe in their eyes, I still have some value. I want to die, but I can't. Do you know how painful it is? But since I didn't die this time, I have to live well. In the past, those who hurt me, those who betrayed me, I will make them pay the price one by one. Qin Feiyang muttered to himself. Although his voice was very soft, it floated clearly into everyone's ears. Everyone could clearly sense a deep helplessness, a kind of persistence, and a kind of determination in these words. All of a sudden, Qin Feiyang raised his halberd. Boom! His aura suddenly erupted. His black hair and clothes fluttered in the wind. The haze between his eyebrows instantly disappeared and was replaced by a trace of fierceness. He glanced at the crowd around the square and said word by word, "Yes, Qin Feiyang, am back. And my return requires blood as a sacrifice." As soon as he finished speaking, his eyes were filled with killing intent. The halberd in his hand suddenly fell and chopped toward the head of the invincible Black Army commander. "You're courting death." But at the same time, the Grand Master's eyes turned cold. He clenched his hand, and the teacup in his hand instantly shattered into pieces. Whoosh! The next moment, he stood up and took a step towards Qin Feiyang. His entire body was overflowing with killing intent. However, Qin Feiyang ignored him. He didn't even look at him. He was still holding the halberd and chopping toward the head of the invincible Black Army commander, because he believed that someone would stop the Grand Master. The invincible Black Army commander was so anxious that he was about to go crazy. If it was before, it would be impossible for Qin Feiyang to kill him. But now, the invincible Black Army commander was imprisoned by the invincible Black Army commander. Facing Qin Feiyang, who was many times weaker than him, he could only watch the butcher's knife fall, just as Qin Feiyang had expected. When the Grand Master made his move, Yiglao, who was standing in front of the window, disappeared without a trace. The next moment, he landed on the square in front of the Grand Master. The Grand Master had to stop. In the blink of an eye, the halberd fell, and suddenly blood gushed out. Along with a desperate scream, the invincible Black Army commander's head fell from his neck and rolled on the ground like a rubber ball. His eyes were wide open and filled with the fear of death. Bang! The headless body also slowly fell to the ground. Blood gushed out from the bowl-sized wound and dyed the square red. This place, once again, the square fell into a dead silence. Looking at the invincible Black Army commander's head, everyone's eyes were filled with horror. A few years ago, this person killed all the princes and almost caused the emperor to lose his bloodline. Now, he killed the invincible Black Army commander without mercy. One must know, the invincible Black Army commander was not only powerful, but he was also a general of the emperor. How could he kill him just like that? In this world, was there anything that this person did not dare to do? Everyone looked at Qin Feiyang. The halberd was still dripping blood. He stood proudly in the middle of the square. His long hair was fluttering in the wind. His 7 feet tall body was incomparably majestic. He was like the god of war, looking down on everyone. Looking at the current Qin Feiyang, everyone's heart was filled with uncontrollable fear. Damn it! Today, none of you will leave the imperial city alive. Commander of the Kirin army, I order you to immediately take your men and kill Qin Feiyang. The Grand Master was also stunned for a moment. Boom! Suddenly, he shouted loudly. His anger was burning the sky. A terrifying pressure surged forth, forcefully sweeping up Elder Yi and flying towards the clouds. As he soared into the clouds, he ordered the commander of the Qilin army. A battle between fake gods could easily destroy the world. Therefore, they could not fight in the city. Although he was furious to the point of insanity, he still had this bit of rationality. Kill me? Qin Feiyang smiled and turned to look at the commander of the Kirin army. The commander of the Kirin army also hesitated. Seeing this, the Grand Master was furious and shouted, "What are you waiting for? Do you want to die? You'd better take care of yourself first." Yiglao sneered and charged at the Grand Master with full strength. The great Qin Empire has stood for 10,000 years. It is not something that you can shake. The Grand Master laughed angrily. Boom! Crack! The battle between the two false divinities began at the top of the clouds. For a moment, in the sky, the wind and clouds surged. Every time the two collided, it was as deafening as thunder. Everywhere they went, the void was shattered. Chapter 9:21. In the square below, Qin Feiyang only glanced at old Yi and the State Master. Then he didn't pay attention to the battle anymore. Withdrawing his gaze, he looked at the commander of the Qilin army again and said, I can kill the commander of the invincible Black Army without hesitation, so I can also kill you without hesitation. So, before you make your move, you better think clearly. What? He threatened to kill the commander of the Kirin army. Are you kidding me? When everyone heard this, they were all extremely bewildered. Previously, the commander of the invincible Black Army was killed by Qin Feiyang because he was restricted by the black-cloaked old man's imposing aura and didn't have the power to resist. But now, the black-robed old man was restrained by the Grand Master, and there was no pressure to restrain the commander of the Kirin army. How could Qin Feiyang kill him? Are you stupid? You actually dare to say such words that overestimate yourself. I'm the commander of the Kirin army. My duty is to maintain the order and peace of the great Qin Empire. But now you're destroying the order here, so I have no choice. The commander of the Kirin army looked at Qin Feiyang and sighed deeply. Qin Feiyang frowned and said, You're willing to give up your life for the so-called order and peace. Yes, the commander of the Kirin army said without hesitation. He then waved his hand and shouted, Kill Qin Feiyang with all your strength. As soon as he finished his words, the surrounding invincible Black Army soldiers rushed towards Qin Feiyang with halberds in their hands. Every one of them was exuding a terrifying aura, which shocked everyone. Their eyes were shining with a fierce light. However, before they could get close, whoosh! 5 figures appeared beside Qin Feiyang at the same time. They were the mysterious lady, Mu Qing, the first ancestor, the second ancestor, and the middle-aged man from the Endless Sea. Mu Qing glanced at the Iron Black Army and said with a smile, How should we deal with them? Leave no one alive, Qin Feiyang said coldly. Mu Qing turned to look at the first ancestor and the second ancestor and said with a smile, Ancestors, it's up to you. The 2 ancestors looked at each other and smiled. Then they turned into 2 streams of light and rushed toward the Iron Black Army. Immediately, shrill screams resounded in this place. The 2 were like ghosts coming and going without a trace. The invincible Black Army didn't even have time to discover them before they were killed. In less than 5 breaths, the invincible Black Army in the square was completely annihilated. The ground was littered with corpses and severed limbs. The bloody scene was enough to make anyone shudder. They killed the Iron Black Army. They're so strong. Where did these people come from? Everyone was thinking about too. Originally, Qin Feiyang was in a situation where he would definitely die. However, a group of people suddenly appeared, each one more terrifying than the other. My cousin is quite a bit of my cousin, is he? Is quite a lot cousin is brother is a lot. Lu Zheng chuckled. Yeah. Who would have thought that Feiyang could find so many people to help him? There are 2 false gods among them. The old man in sackcloth laughed. What? 2 false gods? Lu Zheng was shocked. The burly man also looked at the old man in sackcloth in surprise. The old man in sackcloth said, In addition to the black-robed old man who fought with the state preceptor, the other false god is that middle-aged man. The 2 of them immediately looked at the middle-aged man standing beside the mysterious madam. Their hearts were in turmoil. 2 false gods came to save Qin Feiyang. Isn't this too unbelievable? According to the heavens, I jade, there are 4 false gods here. Now, including the state preceptor, there are 3. Who is the other one? The burly man suddenly said. This person hides very well. If he doesn't show up, we won't be able to detect his aura. The old man in sackcloth glanced at the crowd outside. His eyebrows were full of confusion. At the same time, in another private room, a white-haired old man wearing a mask stood in front of the window. Although his expression couldn't be seen clearly from his eyes, there was a gratified smile. Don! Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Come in. The white-haired old man opened his mouth. His voice was very calm. The door opened, and 4 young men and women entered the room one after another. If Qin Feiyang was here, he would recognize these 4 people at a glance. They were Ling Yu, Zhao Yu, Luo Dan, and Feng Ranran. The 4 of them walked to the window. Ling Yu looked at Qin Feiyang in the square and said with a smile, Now you can rest assured. Rest assured. The white-haired old man nodded. Zhao Yu asked, Then how long do we have to lurk in the temple? The white-haired old man pondered for a while and said with a smile, Feiyang is not in the temple. There is not much point in you continuing to lurk. After Feiyang leaves, you will also follow this old man to cultivate in seclusion. When the 4 of them heard this, they all seemed relieved and let out a long breath. Ling Yu asked again, Then when can we confess our identities to Qin Feiyang? No hurry. Soon the miracle will open. At that time, I will send you to the Forgotten Continent and continue to assist Feiyang. Of course, this is also a good opportunity for you to train. There are countless opportunities and great fortunes in the miracle. If you can get it, it is not impossible for you to become a god in the future. The white-haired old man smiled. Become a god. The 4 of them looked at each other in shock. In the square, seeing a group of invincible black army soldiers being killed by the Mu family's ancestor and second ancestor, the commander of the Kirin army was so shocked that he couldn't recover for a long time. Similarly, the state preceptor who was fighting with Yigleo in the sky was also shocked. This time is not like the last time. This time we came prepared. Even if your great Qin Empire sent out all the experts, you can't stop us. Yigleo smiled confidently, and his attacks became more and more fierce. Come prepared. The state preceptor was shocked. While dealing with Yigleo, he looked at Mu Qing and the others. Immediately, his pupils shrank. Mu Qing's strength was naturally not a concern. He could also see through the cultivation of the Mu family's ancestor, second ancestor, and the mysterious madam at a glance. However, although he couldn't sense any aura from the middle-aged man, he gave him a strong sense of crisis. At the same time, as if sensing the state preceptor's gaze, the middle-aged man suddenly raised his head and looked at the state preceptor. The moment their eyes met, the state preceptor's body and mind trembled, as if he was struck by lightning. Fake god! How could it be? There was actually another fake god. Is it worth it for you to do this for a mere Qin Feiyang? He pushed Yigleo back with a palm strike and was extremely shocked and angry. Whether it is worth it or not, we know it in our hearts. You don't need to know, Yigleo said expressionlessly. Once again, he carried a monstrous aura and pressed down on the state preceptor. The state preceptor was obviously beginning to feel a little powerless. It was not because he was weak, but because he was afraid. Facing 2 fake gods, he couldn't handle it alone. He never expected that 2 fake gods would come to save Qin Feiyang. If he knew this would happen, he would have directly killed Qin Feiyang in the divine prison, even if he risked disobeying the emperor. Unfortunately, it was all too late. At the same time, in the square below, Mu Qing pointed to the commander of the Kirin army and asked, Do you want to kill him? Qin Feiyang said lightly, Do I need your help to kill him? Mu Qing pursed his lips into a wry smile. This was really asking for trouble. Qin Feiyang looked at the commander of the Kirin army and said, "Is the Hao Tian Palace still in its original position?" "Yes." The commander of the Kirin army nodded. "Humph." Qin Feiyang snorted from his nose, threw away the halberd in his hand, and waved his hand to open a portal. "Where are you going?" The mysterious madam frowned. "There are still some things that need to be solved." Qin Feiyang's eyes flashed coldly, and he entered the portal without looking back. So troublesome. The mysterious madam was a little annoyed. Although they had two fake gods, this was the capital of the Great Qin Empire after all. Moreover, they knew nothing about the background of the Great Qin Empire. Who knew if there were other hidden powerhouses? So, it was better to leave as soon as possible. "Stop complaining, hurry up, and follow," Mu Qing said with a frown. She was also a little angry, and quickly rushed into the portal. The mysterious madam, the great ancestor, the second ancestor, and the middle-aged man looked at each other and could only helplessly follow. As for Yiglao, they were not worried, because with the strength of the state preceptor, it was not enough to hurt Yiglao. Moreover, the distance between the first district and the imperial palace was not too far. If something really happened to Yiglao, they could come to support him immediately. Seeing this situation, the commander of the Kirin army immediately opened the portal and rushed to the Bright Sky Palace. After Qin Feiyang and the others left, the crowd around the square immediately became restless. Why did Qin Feiyang go to the Bright Sky Palace? Could it be that he was going to kill the little prince? The more they thought about it, the more they felt that it was possible. After all, Qin Feiyang killed the emperor's son in one fell swoop. And now this little prince was not only named Qin Haoyan, but the emperor also created a Bright Sky Palace for him. This would definitely anger Qin Feiyang. According to Qin Feiyang's usual style, he would never let it go. "Grandpa, what should we do?" Rin Wushuang looked at the old man anxiously. She knew Qin Feiyang's character too well. After going to the Bright Sky Palace, he would definitely do something outrageous. The Imperial Palace is not a place you and I can enter. It's useless to be anxious. Just wait for the news. The old man sighed. "I can bring you guys in." Lu Xingqian smiled faintly. With a wave of his hand, he disappeared with the old man and the others. "Are we going to the Imperial Palace?" In another private room, Ling Yu and the others looked at the white-haired old man and asked, "This old man will go alone. You all wait here." After saying that, the white-haired old man disappeared into thin air. "Second Grandpa, Uncle Black, what do we do now?" At the same time, Lu Zheng also looked at the old man in sackcloth and the burly man, not knowing what to do. The old man in sackcloth looked at Yiglao and the imperial tutor who were fighting in the clouds, and his old eyes flashed. "The situation here is settled, and we are no longer needed. Come back to the village with us first, take that artifact, and make a trip to the Forgotten Continent." Forgotten Continent? Lu Zheng was stunned and asked, "What is that place?" "It's a place that scares people, but also makes people yearn for it. You'll know when you get there." Chapter 922. Bright Heaven Palace. Everything was still the same as before. The woman in white knelt in front of the entrance of the garden, looking extremely haggard. The two maids had been persuading her in a low voice, but she was indifferent. The Kirin army guarding Bright Heaven Palace sighed inwardly. It was not easy for the Empress. At the same time, they had already noticed the battle between Yiglao and the imperial tutor. After all, the two were pseudo-gods, and the battle fluctuations were so terrifying that it was hard not to notice. However, they did not know what happened in the first city district. After all, everything happened too quickly, and the news had not reached here yet. The woman in white knew that the person fighting with the imperial tutor was Yiglao, because she had seen Yiglao in the divine prison. However, in her opinion, Yiglao alone could not save Qin Feiyang. The key was still to change the emperor's mind. Therefore, she did not leave. Swoosh! Suddenly, above Bright Heaven Palace, the void distorted and 5 figures descended one after another. It was Qin Feiyang's group of 5. Who is it? The people guarding Bright Heaven Palace detected the appearance of the 5 people right away and raised their heads to look over. 14th Prince. Immediately, everyone's expression changed. Empress, look, His Highness is here. The 2 maids also exclaimed in surprise. Tian, the woman in white looked up at Qin Feiyang. Her eyes suddenly filled with tears. Mother, at the same time, looking at the haggard woman in white kneeling on the ground. Qin Feiyang's heart ached. A monstrous anger emerged in his heart. He turned to look at the middle-aged man from the endless ocean and bowed. Senior, I have a request. He was unfamiliar with this middle-aged man, but since he came with Mu Qing and the others, he must be here to help him. Although the middle-aged man hid his cultivation, the sense of crisis he brought was no less than Yiglao and the imperial tutor. This was enough to prove that the middle-aged man was also a pseudo-god. I was entrusted by her to help you. As long as she agrees, I can do anything for you. The middle-aged man pointed at the mysterious madam and said coldly. Qin Feiyang looked at the mysterious madam gratefully and transmitted his voice. I want you to help Yiglao capture the imperial advisor. Capture him? The middle-aged man frowned and said, if I join forces with Yiglao, it won't be difficult to capture him, but here, Junior understands Senior's concerns. I'm afraid that there are other experts hiding in the imperial palace. However, Senior can rest assured, as long as you can capture the imperial preceptor, even if there are other false gods hiding here, they will have no choice but to hold back. Because the state preceptor is not only the state preceptor, but also the teacher of the emperor. The emperor will not watch him die. Qin Feiyang said coldly. He also wanted to use the state preceptor to force the emperor to sign an unequal contract. Of course, if he had the chance to kill the imperial tutor, he wouldn't show any mercy. I see. Realization dawned upon them. No wonder the state preceptor had so much authority in the great Qin Empire. Even the emperor couldn't control him. So it was because of this relationship. The mysterious madam looked at the middle-aged man and said with a smile, Go, we will take care of things here. If it really doesn't work, we can also hide in the castle temporarily. All right, I will end this quickly. The middle-aged man nodded, opened a portal, and quickly left. When the portal dissipated, Qin Feiyang glanced at the bright sky palace not far away and took a step forward, landing beside his mother. Greetings, Your Highness. The 2 maids quickly knelt on the ground and bowed. Thank you for taking care of my mother. Qin Feiyang looked at the 2 girls gratefully. He still had some impression of these 2 maids. They were his mother's people. Until now, they had not left his mother, which showed that they were loyal to his mother. This is what we should do, the 2 maids said with fear. Although they were not unfamiliar with Qin Feiyang, it was only when he was young. When he was young, Qin Feiyang gave people a warm feeling. But now, Qin Feiyang gave people a kind of fear that came from the bottom of their hearts. Qin Feiyang smiled faintly and turned to look at his mother. His eyes were full of self-blame. Mother, I'm sorry. I made you worry about your son again. He knelt on the ground. His heart was like a knife being twisted, and his face was full of pain. Tian, the white-clothed woman, reached out and touched Qin Feiyang's face and said with a smile, As long as you are fine, it doesn't matter what your mother does. Qin Feiyang couldn't help but clench his hands. If his mother scolded him a few times, he would feel better. But the more his mother was like this, the more uncomfortable he felt, and his hatred for the emperor grew stronger. At this time, the commander of the Kirin army also arrived. Looking at Qin Feiyang, this pitiful mother and son, he also felt sad. Qin Feiyang suppressed his hatred for the emperor and said with a smile, "Mother, your son is fine. Quickly get up." With his help, the white-clothed woman finally stood up. But after kneeling for an entire morning, her legs were numb. "Come and support the Empress." Qin Feiyang looked at the two maids and said, "Yes." The two maids hurriedly went up and supported the white-clothed woman on both sides. "Tian, don't act recklessly." The white-clothed woman grabbed Qin Feiyang's hand and shook her head. Qin Feiyang said with a smile, "Don't worry, mother. Your son won't act recklessly." At the same time, he gently pushed away the white-clothed woman's hand and turned to look at the Kirin army. He saw that the Kirin army guarding Haotian Palace were all vigilant. Swish! Suddenly, Qin Feiyang rushed into the sky and looked down at Haotian Palace, a cold light surging in his eyes. "I said last time there is no need for this place to exist. Be destroyed!" He raised his arm and pointed in the air with his index finger. Returning to ruins, a terrifying invisible force, like a torrent of beasts, roared towards Haotian Palace. "Presumptuous! Don't mess around!" A group of Kirin army roared and rushed towards Qin Feiyang with an amazing saint aura. "The presumptuous ones are you." The Mu clan's second forefather smiled coldly. The Emperor's aura was like a waterfall, sweeping in all directions. "Stop!" Seeing this, the commander of the Kirin army shouted angrily, looking very anxious. But the Mu clan's second forefather turned a deaf ear, his eyes full of cruelty. "Ah!" A series of screams resounded through the sky. There was no suspense. The Kirin army, under the pressure of the Mu clan's second forefather, had no power to resist. Their bodies were crushed alive by the Mu clan's second forefather's pressure one after another. Blood was like a waterfall reflecting the sky. Looking at this scene, the commander of the Kirin army was filled with grief and indignation, but his heart was full of powerlessness. The people who came to rescue Qin Feiyang this time were too strong. As the commander of the Kirin army, he was not useful at all. In the blink of an eye, that formless force also blasted into Bright Heaven Palace. But also at this moment, a mighty emperor's aura emerged from Haotian Palace and instantly disintegrated the invisible force. The invisible force was Qin Feiyang's battle art, the returning to ruins art. Therefore, the disintegration of the invisible force also caused a certain amount of damage to him. Puff! He spat out a mouthful of blood, but his eyes became colder. Swish! The next moment, the emperor appeared outside Haotian Palace, standing in the air with Qin Feiyang. He wore a dragon robe and his face was cold. The emperor's aura enveloped all directions. He was like the ruler of heaven and earth descending, bringing a sense of oppression that was stronger than the state preceptor. The emperor looked at Qin Feiyang and said expressionlessly, "Remember last time, we also stood opposite each other in this hostile relationship." "What? Do you want to fight again? I could defeat you last time, and I can do the same this time." Qin Feiyang sneered, his expression incomparably fierce. Defeat the emperor? The mysterious lady, the Mu family's great ancestor, and the second ancestor looked at each other. Back then, they indeed fought here. However, the emperor suppressed his cultivation. Even so, Qin Feiyang was the victor. Mu Qing whispered. Amazing! The three of them were secretly speechless. At the same time, the emperor glanced at Mu Qing and the other three, then looked at Qin Feiyang and said, "No matter what, this is our family matter." Isn't it a little inappropriate for you to let outsiders get involved? Family. Qin Feiyang shook his head and laughed. Did he have a family? No. He had long despaired of this place, leaving only disgust. Are you admitting defeat now? Back then, when you crippled my cultivation and expelled me from the imperial capital, did you ever think that there would be such a day? Qin Feiyang teased. The emperor was silent. Sigh. Qin Feiyang shook his head and sighed. Things have come to this, and you still won't tell me the reason? If you want me to die, Shouldn't you at least let me know the reason? Sometimes it's better to be confused. You're just too smart. The emperor finally spoke, but he said something that Qin Feiyang couldn't understand at all. Confused? Sorry, I'm not born to pretend to be confused. What about the little prince? Won't you let me see him? I really want to know how extraordinary he is to be able to replace me, Qin Feiyang said, his face full of curiosity. The emperor frowned and shook his head. I won't let you see him. That's not up to you. Qin Feiyang's eyes were cold as he looked down at the mysterious lady, the Mu family's great ancestor, and cupped his hands. I'll have to trouble the three of you to help me destroy this Haotian palace. The three of them were a little hesitant. This time, they only came to save Qin Feiyang. They really didn't want to care about other things. Moreover, looking at the current emperor, they had a faint, ominous premonition in their hearts, because the emperor was too calm. However, Qin Feiyang was determined to destroy this Haotian palace today. Seeing that the three of them were motionless, his eyes narrowed slightly, and a mighty dragon's might rushed out of his body. Roar! Accompanied by a loud dragon roar, the purple-gold dragon soul appeared out of thin air. Qin Feiyang jumped up and landed on the head of the purple-gold dragon soul. He looked down at the emperor and shouted, Do you see that? This is the dragon soul that an emperor should have. What's that mere golden dragon soul of yours? At that moment, the purple-gold dragon soul roared and swooped down at the emperor with Qin Feiyang. The dragon's might was mighty and intimidating in all directions. Tian, or stop it. He's your biological father, after all. Seeing this, the woman in white cried out anxiously, Mother, this is between me and him. Don't interfere. Chapter 9:23. He was also forcing the mysterious lady, the Mu clan's great ancestor, and the second ancestor to make a move. Because, whether it was him and the mysterious lady or him and the Mu clan, they were all using each other. Since that was the case, why didn't he take advantage of the opportunity? Bastard, you really know how to find trouble. Seeing this, the mysterious lady cursed angrily and did not dare to hesitate any longer. Her aura erupted and rushed towards the emperor before Qin Feiyang could. The Mu clan's great ancestor and second ancestor looked at each other, gritted their teeth, and rushed towards the emperor like lightning. Since they were already here, they might as well go all out. If they could kill the emperor now, it would be over. The mysterious lady and the other two attacked with all their might, and the emperor did not dare to be careless, because the aura they exuded was that of a 9-star combat emperor. Roar! Golden light surged behind the emperor, and a golden dragon soul soared into the sky. The dragon's aura rolled in all directions. You have to think carefully. If you fight with them here, the little prince may be killed by the fluctuations of your battle. Qin Feiyang pursed his lips with a hint of ridicule as he reminded the emperor. The emperor's gaze sank slightly, and he was obviously hesitating. The mysterious lady, the Mu clan's great ancestor, and the second ancestor seized the opportunity to attack together. Bang! 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 The emperor was blasted into the sky on the spot, and the three followed. Qin Feiyang looked up at the emperor, and then looked at the bright heaven palace again. This time, let's see who can stop me. Qin Feiyang smiled coldly and pointed his index finger in the air. Another invisible force pounced towards bright, heavenly palace frenziedly. I won't sit back and watch. Swish! However, at this moment, the commander of the Kirin army stood above the bright heaven palace with a trace of determination in his eyes. You can't stop me. Qin Feiyang shook his head, and with a slight thought, the commander of the Kirin army immediately held his head and howled. His body also lost its calm and fell towards the garden below. Boom! That invisible force finally blasted into the bright heaven palace. Accompanied by an earth-shaking loud noise, the bright heaven palace was instantly razed to the ground, and dust billowed. Amidst the dust, Qin Feiyang keenly sensed a saint aura. He raised his eyebrows and waved his hand. Immediately, a gust of wind blew. The dust was quickly blown away, revealing everything. Amidst the ruins, a woman with a dusty face was protecting a small child behind her. The woman was the current empress. However, at this moment, her phoenix coronet was crooked, her phoenix robe was torn, and her body was covered in dust. Although he didn't suffer any injuries, he seemed to be in a sorry state. She was now also staring at Qin Feiyang, her eyes full of resentment and hatred. As for the little child, he was hiding behind the current empress. His big, black eyes were staring at Qin Feiyang with fear. Whoosh! Qin Feiyang took a step forward and landed in front of Celestial Empress. He examined the little child and smiled. "This is my little brother." "Go away." The current empress protected the little child with both hands, her face filled with panic. "Go away." Qin Feiyang looked at her and shook his head. "Compared to Mother, you are really worse than a piece of trash. I really don't understand why the emperor made you his empress. Is he blind?" The current empress was not strong. In the past, he was still weak and could not see through her. But now he could tell at a glance that this woman was just a one-star battle saint. "Even if I'm not strong enough, I can still kill you." The current empress flew into a rage out of humiliation. Now, she was the empress of the great Qin Empire, the mother of the empire. How could she be offended by an abandoned little bastard? She took a step toward Qin Feiyang. Her arm shot out like an eagle's claw toward Qin Feiyang's head. "Really?" Qin Feiyang smiled disdainfully. The double-winged snow eagle appeared without warning, its eyes flashing with a terrifying, ferocious light. Boom! The saint aura surged and rushed toward the current empress. Ah! The current empress let out a painful cry and was sent flying, blood gushing out. Whoosh! At the same time, Qin Feiyang also took a step forward and landed in front of the little prince with a bright smile on his face. "Please don't hurt him." The current empress' expression changed as she hurriedly pleaded. High up in the sky, the emperor was also burning with anxiety, but he was trapped by the mysterious madam and the other two and could not escape at all. The white-robed woman also hurriedly said, "Tian, you can't make any more mistakes." "I'm not wrong." Qin Feiyang roared, scaring the little boy so much that he fell to the ground on his butt. The commander of the Kirin army also looked worried. Qin Feiyang did not really erase his soul. This was because, although this person was working for the emperor, he would sometimes think for the emperor and his mother. He was also loyal and could be kept alive. But now, the commander of the Kirin army did not dare to step forward. This was because if Qin Feiyang wanted to kill the little prince now, he could do it with a wave of his hand, and the commander would not be able to stop him. And in the face of Qin Feiyang's roar, the white-robed woman's body could not help but tremble slightly, and then she fell silent. She understood that continuing to persuade Qin Feiyang would only backfire. "Who?" Qin Feiyang took a deep breath and calmed down a little. He squatted on the ground, looked at the little boy, and asked with a smile, "Your name is Qin Haotian?" The little boy was terrified. Qin Feiyang smiled and said, "Do you know? Actually, my name is also Qin Haotian." It was probably the smile on Qin Feiyang's face that infected the little boy, and the little boy was not as scared as before. He asked timidly, "Really?" His voice was very young, and his words were somewhat vague and difficult to understand. It was obvious that he had just learned to speak. "Really? So the two of us are very fated." Qin Feiyang nodded and smiled, reaching out to pick up the little boy. Seeing this, the current empress, the emperor, the commander of the Kirin army, and Qin Feiyang's mother all had their hearts in their throats. They were afraid that Qin Feiyang would kill the little prince on impulse. "Big brother, what is fate?" The little prince, who seemed to have completely put aside his fear, looked at Qin Feiyang curiously and asked confusedly. After all, he was a child and his mind was relatively simple. Seeing Qin Feiyang's amiable look, he was not afraid. It is fate that you and I met. It is also fate that we were born in the same place. Qin Feiyang said with a smile. The little prince said in surprise, Big brother was also born here. Yes, I used to live here like you. Qin Feiyang nodded. Are you also father's child? But why haven't I seen you before? The little prince asked innocently. Qin Feiyang glanced at the emperor, looked at the little boy and nodded. Yes, we were born of the same father, but our fates were different. I was abandoned. Then you are my brother? The little prince asked. Brother. Qin Feiyang's body stiffened. The word brother seemed to have touched his heartstrings. Brother, can you tell me why father abandoned you? It feels so complicated. The little prince said again, Yes, it's very complicated. You are still young, and you won't understand even if I tell you. Qin Feiyang sighed deeply, then rubbed the little prince's head and said with a smile, I have a few words for you to tell father. Be good and don't move. Okay. The little prince nodded with an innocent smile on his face. Qin Feiyang looked up at the emperor, and his eyes instantly became cold. He said, I don't ask for much. Just tell me why you tried to kill me back then. The mysterious lady and the other two had stopped, but they surrounded the emperor. When the emperor heard this, he pondered for a moment, looked at Qin Feiyang and said, What if I don't say it? Qin Feiyang said, For the current me, other than my mother, there is no family to speak of. You should know what I will do. So, you plan to continue to harm your brother? Suddenly, a hoarse voice sounded. Swish! Immediately after, a white figure descended above Bright Sky Palace. It was an old man, wearing a white robe, white hair, and a white beard. He exuded an otherworldly aura. Qin Feiyang had seen this person before. It was the old man guarding the pagoda, Old Man Qin. Brother. Qin Feiyang looked at Old Man Qin, shook his head, and said, Then I want to ask you, is the family of the emperor reliable? If it is, then why did the first prince and the rest want me dead? Old Man Qin was speechless. Swish! After Old Man Qin, another figure descended out of thin air. There were the two black-robed old men guarding the divine prison. There were also the Kirin army and the Black Iron Army in armor. There was also a group of people wearing the uniform of the divine temple. They were the law enforcers of the divine temple. The aura exuded by each of them was extremely terrifying, especially those law enforcers. They were filled with an amazing, murderous aura. Seeing these people appear, the mysterious lady, Mujia's ancestor, and the second ancestor immediately fell in front of Qin Feiyang. Their eyes were full of vigilance. How is their strength? Qin Feiyang asked via voice transmission. The mysterious lady secretly said, They are all very strong, especially the old man who appeared first. He gave us a strong sense of crisis. He should be a false god. False god. Qin Feiyang's eyes trembled. The person the mysterious lady was referring to was Old Man Qin. He had guessed before that this Old Man Qin must be very strong, but he didn't expect him to be strong to this extent. It seems that he really knows nothing about the background of the great Qin Empire. He couldn't help but wonder if there were other false gods lurking in the imperial palace in addition to Old Man Qin and the state preceptor. Rumble. Kacha! On the top of the clouds, the battle between Yigleo and the middle-aged man with the state preceptor had reached its climax, and the battlefield of the three people was gradually approaching the imperial palace. Old Man Qin looked up at the sky. His eyes were incomparably deep. Swish! Suddenly, his eyes flashed with a cold light. He looked down at Qin Feiyang and said, Hand over the little prince immediately and surrender. With just you? Qin Feiyang sneered. Young man, don't be too arrogant. The imperial capital is not a place where you can be presumptuous. Old Man Qin's body shook. a mighty aura emerged and shrouded Qin Feiyang and the others. "It's really a false god." The mysterious lady's pupils shrank and anxiously said to Qin Feiyang, "Quickly go into the castle!" Now, Yigleo and the middle-aged man were fighting with the state preceptor and had no time to support. If they were controlled by old man Qin's aura, then they would be wiped out. However, Qin Feiyang didn't panic at all. He grinned and said, "It seems that you really don't care about his life in that case." Chapter 924. No. The current empress hurriedly stood between Qin Feiyang and Elder Qin. She looked at Elder Qin and said, "Don't do anything. He will really hurt Tian. Don't worry, Empress. He won't dare to touch the little prince, because as long as something happens to the little prince, he will lose his protective talisman." Elder Qin said. Qin Feiyang grinned and said, "You're smart, but didn't you forget something? I still have an ancient castle." The ancient castle was his real protective talisman. Elder Qin raised his eyebrows and looked up at the emperor. He bowed and said, "Your Majesty, how do you want to deal with it?" The emperor looked at Qin Feiyang in silence. A moment later, he looked at the little prince again. After a long time, he looked at Qin Feiyang and said, "Although I like him very much, it doesn't mean that you can use him to threaten me. You can have another son if you lose him." Qin Feiyang's eyes trembled. How heartless must the emperor be to say such words? He didn't dare to doubt it, because he was the best example. The emperor could abandon him, and he could also abandon the little prince now. The emperor said coldly, "Tell me, what do you want?" Qin Feiyang took a deep breath and said, "I want you to promise me that you will never hurt my mother and everyone related to me." His mother didn't want to leave the imperial capital, so he had to make plans for her future. As for those related to him, there were even more. For example, Luo Qinxue, Mermaid Princess Yan Nanshan, and so on. The emperor said in a deep voice, "You are the first person who dares to negotiate with me. Then shouldn't I be honored?" Qin Feiyang sneered. The emperor narrowed his eyes slightly and said, "You have repeatedly offended my dignity. Do you think I will agree?" At this moment, at the top of the clouds, a painful scream suddenly sounded. Everyone looked up. They saw that the battle between the state preceptor and Yigleo had shifted to the sky above the imperial palace. Under the joint attack of Yigleo, the imperial tutor was severely injured and in imminent danger. The emperor raised his eyebrows and ordered, "Old Qin, go and help the imperial tutor." Yes, old man Qin bowed in response and soared into the sky. "It's better for you to stay here." But suddenly, a faint laugh came from the vicinity of Bright Heaven Palace. Following closely, a white-haired old man wearing a mask soared into the sky and blocked old man Qin's path. It was the old man who had been with Ling Yu and the others not long ago. "What? Another false god?" Old man Qin exclaimed as he looked at the masked old man. His face was filled with disbelief. Hearing old Qin's exclamation, everyone present turned pale with fright, including the emperor and Qin Feiyang. Qin Feiyang asked in surprise, "Mu Qing, is she one of us?" "No." Mu Qing shook her head. "No. Then who is he?" Qin Feiyang looked at the masked old man. Suddenly, he noticed the masked old man's eyes, and his gaze trembled slightly. The masked old man's eyes actually gave him an inexplicable sense of familiarity, but the masked old man's temperament made him feel very unfamiliar. What was going on? Had he seen him somewhere before? Qin Feiyang racked his brains to think. At the same time, the emperor looked at the masked old man and asked, "Who are you?" "This old man is just a nosy person. You don't have to be too nervous." The masked old man laughed hoarsely. The emperor raised his eyebrows and said in a deep voice, I'm afraid you can't control the matters here." "That's not necessarily true." The masked old man chuckled and looked up at the imperial tutor and Yigleo. Qin Feiyang and the others also looked up again. They saw that under the siege of Yigleo and Old Man Qin, the already seriously injured imperial tutor was now in a mess and in an extremely sorry state. The emperor retracted his gaze and looked at the masked old man. "Are you stalling for time?" The masked old man smiled faintly and did not deny it. As long as Old Man Qin was restrained, it was only a matter of time before Yigleo and the middle-aged man took down the imperial tutor. Old Man Qin suddenly turned and looked at the emperor and bowed. "Your Majesty, please ask them to come out." Qin Feiyang and the others were stunned and immediately looked at the emperor and Old Man Qin in surprise. Who were they? Was there really another false god in this imperial palace? Looking at the emperor again, hearing Old Man Qin's words, his face was uncertain and seemed to be hesitating about something. "Tian, quickly take your people and leave the imperial capital." It was also at this moment the white-clothed woman transmitted her voice to Qin Feiyang, and her tone seemed to be extremely anxious. "Mother, what's going on? Who made you so afraid?" Qin Feiyang secretly said. "Don't ask any more, let's go," the white-clothed woman urged. "Actually, you don't have to worry." The masked old man glanced at Qin Feiyang and the others and suddenly laughed. "What do you mean?" Qin Feiyang and the others looked at him again. There are indeed a few false gods hidden in the imperial palace, but they won't make a move easily, because their lifespan is coming to an end. They have all entered a state of self-sealing. The masked old man said. The emperor looked at him in shock and anger and said, "How do you know so clearly? Who are you?" The masked old man laughed and said, "Didn't this old man already say just now? This old man is just a busybody." Self-sealing. Qin Feiyang's eyes flashed. Of course, he also knew about the so-called self-sealing. When he and Lu Xingqian entered the canyon below the ruins to look for Rin Duxing, the holy monkey they encountered was in a state of self-sealing, and there were only two possibilities for people who sealed themselves. The first was that they were seriously injured and in danger, hiding from the pursuit of strong enemies. Entering a state of self-sealing, their aura would completely disappear. Even through a piece of paper, it would be impossible to detect. It was a very good escape method. Of course, this was also a double-edged sword. If they were discovered, they would only have a dead end, because after self-sealing, they would have no fighting power. The second was that they were nearing the end of their lifespan. Some old antiques who were nearing the end of their lifespan would choose to seal themselves because they didn't want to die. In this way, the life force in their body would stop flowing away. In other words, they would always maintain the state before they were sealed, waiting for the future generations to find a way to extend their lives. However, they must not let their guard down because of this, because these people who sealed themselves were not really nearing the end of their lifespan. They were just nearing the end of their lifespan. Although there was only a word difference between nearing the end of one's lifespan and reaching the end of one's lifespan, the meaning was as different as heaven and earth. Nearing the end of one's lifespan, they would die soon. Nearing the end of one's lifespan, they would die soon, but there was still a period of time to live. These people who were nearing the end of their lifespan, as long as they were not sealed for too long, could still display their peak fighting power after the seal was removed. The reason why they said this was because if they sealed themselves for too long, their cultivation would also drop bit by bit with the passage of time. Your Majesty, this matter has already involved the fate and safety of our great Qin Empire. We can't hesitate any longer. Old Qin spoke again. No. The emperor decisively waved his hand, looked at Qin Feiyang and shouted, "Take your people and get out of here! If you don't agree to my conditions, I won't leave." Qin Feiyang shook his head. The safety of his mother was more important than anything else. "You are really stubborn. Although I don't want to alarm them, if it really comes to that point, I will not hesitate to ask them to come out of seclusion. The emperor's eyes were cold, a golden light flashed in front of him, and a golden bell appeared. Now, as long as I ring this golden bell, someone will immediately use blood to remove the seal for them. At that time, you won't be able to escape even if you have wings. The emperor said in a deep voice. Qin Feiyang's pupils shrank. From the emperor's tone, it was not difficult to tell that those fake gods who sealed themselves had not been sealed for long. This also meant that those fake gods could exert their peak combat strength. If the seal was really removed with the help of the two fake gods, the state preceptor and old Qin, then he and Mu Qing were really doomed today. Hurry up! Qin Feiyang looked up at Yiglao and the middle-aged man. Now he could only rely on these two people. As long as he could take down the state preceptor before the emperor rang the golden bell. Even if those fake gods came out, they would not dare to do anything to him. The battle in the sky was getting more and more intense. The state preceptor's situation was getting worse and worse. Below, old Qin was impatient. Why do we have to go to this step? The emperor looked at Qin Feiyang, shook his head and sighed, then raised his arm and smashed the golden bell with force. Clang! The golden bell shook violently in the void, releasing an earth-shattering sound that reverberated throughout the entire imperial palace. Mu Qing's face suddenly changed and said angrily, Qin Feiyang, if we don't leave now, we will all die here. The mysterious lady, the Mu family's ancestor, and the second ancestor were also anxious. Qin Feiyang's face was also gloomy, but he did not speak for a long time. But his heart was crazily shouting, Quick, quick, quick! The state preceptor was already at the end of the road. As long as Yiglao and the middle-aged man worked harder, they would be able to take him down. Damn it! Seeing this, Mu Qing could not help but curse, looked up at Yiglao and shouted, Old ancestor, quickly open the space-time door! It's too late to leave now. Old Qin sneered, and his divine power rolled, sealing this world. Time passed by breath. About 10 breaths passed. Boom! At the back mountain of the imperial palace, a terrifying aura suddenly emerged. It was all divine power. Without a doubt, the seals on the fake gods that had sealed themselves had already been lifted. 1, 2, 3. At the same time, the mysterious lady closed her eyes and carefully sensed the divine power. All of a sudden, she opened her eyes and said in shock, There are 3 divine powers! Mu Qing, the Mu family's ancestor, and the second ancestor's face instantly turned pale. 3 divine powers were equivalent to 3 fake gods. How could this be played? Qin Feiyang's heart also sank to the bottom. Alas! It seems that this old man still has to make a move. At this time, with a helpless sigh, the masked old man disappeared without a trace. The next moment, he appeared behind the emperor. However, he did not use any weapons, held the emperor hostage, and just stood behind the emperor. But even so, it was enough to make anyone's face change color, because the emperor's cultivation was not yet at the fake god level. If the masked old man wanted to kill him now, it would be too easy. How dare you? Old Qin immediately roared, and his eyes flashed with shocking killing intent. A group of Black Iron Army and Kirin Army also stared at the masked old man with murderous intent. And Qin Feiyang and the others were also shocked. This masked old man's courage was too big, right? Kidnapping the emperor. This was going against the entire Great Qin Empire. However, for them, this was a turning point. Now that the emperor was controlled by the masked old man, these people would definitely not dare to act recklessly. You're tuning in to the Thunder Spear YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.